The gravity in Chamber 4 climbed past 2.5 standard before the first cadet went down, knees folding like wet cardboard, faceplate cracking against the deck with a sound that carried through the floor plating. Milo Vance kept walking his lane, boots printing even, unhurried steps into the crushing air, and did not look over. "Cadet Adair is on the deck," said the voice in the overhead speakers, flat and unbothered, the voice of Instructor Kosh, who never raised it. "Nobody is required to look at Cadet Adair. Cadet Adair is required to get up." Fen Adair did not get up. 2 proctors in exoskeleton lifters came for him at a jog that looked, under the gravity, like a very slow and very grim ballet, and hauled him off the course with his wings dragging. Milo reached the far wall, put his palm flat against the cold alloy the way the drill required, and turned around to walk it again. He was the only human in the cohort, and by the 3rd week of the Deathworld track, the rest of Cohort 9 Reach had stopped finding that strange enough to comment on. What they found strange was that he was not tired. The Deathworld track had one purpose, stated plainly in the enrollment packet that every cadet in the 17 species Combined Officer Corps was told, in one form or another, to fear. It existed to certify that an officer candidate could survive a hostile planetary environment without support, without evacuation, and without breaking, because somewhere out past the settled systems, there were postings where all 3 of those things came true at once, and the Corps had buried enough young officers who could not manage it. Ordessa Combined Officer Academy sat on Kelvac Station, a ring of gray alloy strung around a dead moon, and the Deathworld wing occupied the station's oldest and ugliest section, a block of environmental chambers built 40 years earlier by an engineering corps that had cared more about function than comfort. The corridors smelled of recycled air and ozone. The walls were unpainted. Nobody who walked them was there by accident. Every cadet in 9 Reach had tested into the top decile of their species' physical aptitude scores, and every one of them had been told, at some point in their lives, that they were exceptional. Instructor Kosh Vrathis did not believe in exceptional. He believed in certified and uncertified, and the 11-hour block of gravity, atmosphere, thermal load, and forced endurance that separated the two. He watched Chamber 4 from the observation gallery with 2 of his 4 eyes on the readouts and 2 on the floor, the way his species always split its attention, and found the readout on cadet designation Vance M unremarkable in every number that mattered except 1. Heart rate steady at 104. Lactate curve flat where it should have been climbing. Gait unchanged since the first hour. Kosh was Vrathi, a species that had clawed its way up the food chain of a world with 3 suns, and no mercy, chitin over muscle over a skeleton built for load-bearing that would have shattered a human femur on the first hard landing. He had run this chamber for 11 cohorts. He had watched exactly 4 cadets in 11 years maintain a flat lactate curve past the 2-hour mark. 3 of them had been Vrathi. He did not like what it might mean that the 4th was a species his own government's classification board had rated formally as non-Deathworld, soft world, mild gravity, no apex predation pressure, filed under the same designation as a garden colony. He kept both eyes on the readout a beat longer than he needed to. "Vance," he said into the channel, testing. "Report condition." "Fine, sir," Milo said, not breaking stride. His voice did not climb to be heard over the pressure in his own chest the way the others did. It came out level, almost bored. "Warm in here." Beside Kosh, the deputy proctor, a narrow, quick-blinking Ithir woman named Sunkai, skin the pale wet gray of river stone, gill slits fluttering at her collar in the dry station air, made a small sound that in her species passed for a laugh. "He says warm," she said. "Adair is being carried to medical with a cracked orbital ridge, and this one says warm." "Adair overextended on hour 1 to impress the roster," Kosh said. "Vance has not tried to impress anyone since he arrived." "You say that like it's a compliment." I say it like a data point. Kosh's mandibles clicked once, his species version of a frown. Continue the drill. Down in Chamber 4, the pressure kept climbing. The readouts kept climbing with it. And one by one the rest of the cohort began to buckle. Not from weakness, most of them, but from the particular cruelty of a gravity well that fought every joint at once. Ankles and knees and hips and spine. An enemy with no face to hate and no pattern to learn. A Caloran cadet named Praxis Ille, tall, lean, silver-furred, the top physical score in the cohort and proud of it in the specific way that made lesser cadets orbit him without meaning to. Made it to the 90-minute mark before his hind leg buckled, and he had to catch himself on the rail, breath tearing out of him in long, ragged pulls. He watched Milo pass him on the return lap, steady, unbothered, and something in his lamplit eyes narrowed to a hard, bright line. "You are not tired," Praxis said, not quite a question, more an accusation. "I'm tired," Milo said. "I'm just not done." It was the kind of answer that meant nothing and everything, and Praxis turned it over behind his eyes for the rest of the drill, looking for the crack in it and not finding one. By the 4th hour, 6 of the 14 cadets in 9 Reach had been pulled from the floor. By the 6th, 9. The chamber lights had shifted from white to the amber that meant the automated safety net was watching harder, ready to cut the gravity the instant a heart rate crossed a line that meant something worse than exhaustion. Milo kept walking his lane. He drank water on the schedule the wristband told him to. He did not talk mostly, except once, near hour 7, when Sunkai's voice came over his private channel instead of the general one. "You are not enjoying this," she said. It was not a question either. Her species asked things sideways, testing the water before committing to a real question, the way she'd tested every human she'd ever met since she transferred out of the marine sciences track. "No," Milo agreed. "Then why does it look like you are not fighting it?" Milo thought about that for 4 full steps, boots printing even into the crushing air, before he answered. "Because I already know how this ends," he said. "It ends when it ends. Fighting the part in the middle doesn't change the part at the end. It just makes the middle worse." Sunkai did not have a follow-up question for that. She logged the exchange, flagged it, and did not know, not yet, that she had just written down the exact sentence Kosh Vrathis would spend the next 6 weeks trying to understand. The gravity held at 2.5 for the final 2 hours of Chamber 4, and when the horn sounded and the field dropped back to station standard, 5 cadets remained on their feet out of 14. Milo Vance was one of them. He drank the last of his water, stretched his shoulders once, and asked the proctor at the door, in the same flat, unbothered voice he'd used for 8 hours, what time lunch was being served. The proctor, a broad-shouldered Vrathi corporal who had run this chamber for 6 years, and had never once been asked that question by a cadet who had just finished it, did not have an answer ready. "Cadet," he said instead, "do you understand what you just did?" "I walked in a circle for 8 hours, Milo said. "I understand it fine. I just also want lunch." He meant it. That was the part nobody in the gallery, watching the readouts, quite believed yet, that underneath the flat voice and the even stride there was no performance running, no mask over something cracking beneath it. He was not hiding exhaustion behind calm. He was simply, factually, not as broken by the day as the room expected him to be, and he had not yet learned that this fact unsettled people, because where he came from, it had never once seemed remarkable. The mess hall on Kelvac Station's cadet deck was built for 17 species to eat in the same room without killing each other, which meant it was built mostly out of separation. Filtered air pockets over half the tables, sealed trays for anything with an atmosphere requirement, a wide buffer stripped down the center where nothing was served that any species present found offensive to smell. Milo Vance walked in still damp with sweat, sat down at the human-rated station with a tray of reconstituted protein and field greens, and ate like a man finishing a normal Tuesday. Word had beaten him there. It always did. That's him, said a Corin cadet 2 tables over, feathers along her jaw rising slightly, the way her species did when startled. The one from Chamber 4. He walked out on his own legs, said the cadet next to her, a squat gray-skinned Dural with a voice like gravel shifting. Nobody walks out of Kosh's gravity block on their own legs in week 3. They were not wrong. Nine Reach had run the gravity block twice before, in week 1 and week 2, as a diagnostic, brutal but survivable, meant to sort candidates rather than break them outright. Today's version had been longer, heavier, and unannounced until the doors sealed, because Instructor Kosh did not believe in cadets who trained for the test instead of the job. 5 had finished on their feet. One of them was now eating lunch across the buffer strip from the rest of the room like it was any other meal. Praxis Ille watched him from 3 tables down, tail flicking once against the floor, and did not join the general murmur of the room. He had made it to the 90-minute mark before his leg gave. He had told himself, walking out of that chamber, that the human had simply gotten lucky with a physiology quirk nobody had catalogued yet. Watching him eat now, unbothered, unremarkable, made the explanation feel thinner than it had 10 minutes ago. "You're staring," said Sunkai, sliding her tray onto the bench across from Milo without asking. Her gill slits had gone still, the resting state, which for her species meant curiosity rather than alarm. "I'm not staring," Milo said. "You're staring, I can see you doing it." "I'm assessing." She tilted her head, water beading along the ridge of her skull the way it did whenever she'd been in a dry corridor too long. "You didn't spike. Anywhere. I pulled your vitals feed after the block. Your cortisol markers went up for the first 40 minutes and then they leveled off like your body decided the emergency was over even though the gravity kept climbing." "Sounds about right." "That's not a normal response, Vance. That's a trained response. Most people's bodies don't know how to stop being afraid just because being afraid isn't useful anymore." Milo chewed, considered the question underneath the question, and answered the way he answered most things plainly, without performance, because performing calm had never once occurred to him as a strategy. "Where I grew up, being afraid for 8 hours straight doesn't put out a fire faster. It just means you're tired and scared instead of just tired. So you learn to put the scared part down early and carry the tired part instead. It's lighter." Sunkai turned that over behind her flat black eyes, the same way Praxis had turned over his sentence in the chamber. "Put out a fire," she repeated. "Your homeworld classification says temperate biosphere, low seismic activity, stable climate band. Nothing about fire." "The classification's old," Milo said, and did not elaborate, and went back to his lunch. And that was the first crack in the story the Academy told itself about where he'd come from. A crack nobody in that mess hall was equipped yet to read correctly. Because the classification board that had rated Earth a soft world had done its survey 40 years before the fire seasons in the Ember Flats stopped being seasons and started being a decade. He had grown up in a district that did not appear in any combined core briefing packet. A strip of scorched agricultural country 300 kilometers wide, where the ground burned every dry season, and the water table had dropped too far for the old irrigation grids to matter, where volunteer fire corps recruited 14-year-olds, because the adults who used to do the work had either burned out or moved on, and where the skill that kept you alive was never speed and never strength. It was the ability to keep walking a line, hour after hour, cutting a break in the brush while the world roared 20 meters away, without letting the fear turn into panic and the panic turn into a mistake. He had cut fire line at 15 for 11 hours straight in heat that would have dropped most grown men, because the alternative was a wall of flame reaching the water station before the relief crew did. And he had learned there, in a way that no simulator on Kelvac station could replicate, that the body could be taught to file fear under information instead of alarm, if you gave it enough repetitions and enough reasons. He had never told anyone at the Academy that story in full, because nobody had asked the right question yet, and because in his own accounting it was not an extraordinary story. It was just what growing up in the Ember Flats had cost, and what it had paid back. Instructor Kosh had not gone to lunch. He sat in the observation gallery long after Chamber 4 had cleared, running the readout again, cross-referencing Milo Vance's file against the enrollment record that had put him in 9 Reach in the first place. An enrollment record that, on close reading, contained an irregularity Kosh had noted on his first day reviewing the cohort and set aside as clerical noise. Human cadets were not supposed to be on the Deathworld track by default. Earth's classification sat 2 tiers below the threshold that made the track mandatory. Human cadets were routed instead to the standard officer curriculum, a gentler program built around species with soft-world physiology, unless they specifically petitioned for reassignment. Vance's file showed no petition. It showed a data entry code, 6 digits, filed by a records clerk on Kelvac Station during the cohort's intake week, routing him into 9 Reach, alongside 13 cadets from species whose homeworlds had tried to kill them since the day they were born. It was, on its face, an administrative error. Kosh had seen administrative errors before. They were usually caught within the first week, quietly corrected, the misplaced cadet transferred out before anyone above his pay grade noticed the paperwork had ever been wrong. This one had not been caught. 3 weeks in, it had not been caught, and Kosh found himself, against every instinct that 11 years of running this chamber had built into him, deciding not to be the one who caught it. "You are going to leave the error in the file," Sunkai said, when he told her, later that evening, in the flat-clipped tone she used when she already suspected the answer and wanted to hear him say it out loud. "I am going to see what the error produces," Kosh said. "The Corps does not need another officer who was never tested. It needs to know what it actually has. And if what you have is a cadet who breaks in week 5 because he was never supposed to be carrying this load." Kosh's mandibles clicked, slow, considering. On the readout in front of him, Milo Vance's resting heart rate sat at 68 beats per minute, 4 hours after the hardest gravity block 9 Reach had run all term, lower than it had been before the drill started. "Then I will have learned that too," he said, "but I do not think that is what I am going to learn." The toxic atmosphere block came in the 2nd week of the month, run in Chamber 2, a long, low room that could be flooded with any breathable to somebody, lethal to somebody else gas mixture the instructors chose to program. For this run, Kosh had loaded a compound that mimicked the sulfur-heavy air of a Vrath homeworld swamp basin, thick, acidic, capable of blistering unprotected human lungs inside 4 minutes. Every cadet in 9 Reach wore a rebreather mask rated for the mixture. That was not the test. The test was the 11-kilogram pack, the 90-minute route through a maze of collapsed structure and standing water, and the 12 simulated casualties scattered along it that each cadet had to locate, stabilize, and either carry or drag to the extraction point before their air filters rated life ran out. "Filters are rated for 91 minutes, Kosh said, over the general channel before the doors sealed. "The route is calculated for 84. That leaves 7 minutes of margin for the 12 of you who slow down when you find a casualty you did not expect. Do not spend that margin standing still and admiring your own competence." The door sealed. The gas came up thick and yellow-green, visibility dropping to arm's length within the first 30 meters, and 9 Reach went in. Fen Adair, back from medical with a bandage over his cracked orbital ridge, and a look on his face that said he had something to prove, found his first casualty, dummy wedged under a collapsed girder, and spent 4 minutes trying to lever it free by strength alone, wings beating uselessly against the low ceiling, before Milo's voice came over the short-range channel. The one cadets weren't technically supposed to use to coach each other. But nobody policed closely once the gas was up, and the readouts were the only thing anyone in the gallery actually watched. "Don't lift it," Milo said. "Rock it. Left corner first, it's pinned on the right." Fen rocked it. The girder shifted. The dummy came free in 11 seconds, and Fen did not have time to ask how the human 3 corridors over had known the exact angle of the pin without seeing it, because the second casualty was already 20 meters ahead, and the clock was still running. Praxis Ille found his second casualty at the bottom of a flooded stairwell, submerged past its shoulders, and stood at the top of the steps for 4 full seconds doing the math on filter time versus waiting in versus the risk that the water level in a chamber built to be unpredictable might not stay where the diagram said it would. 4 seconds was not long. In a chamber where margins were measured in minutes, it was long enough to matter. He went in. The water came up past his chest, cold enough to seize the breath out of him even through the rebreather, and he hauled the dummy up the steps with his hind legs shaking under a weight his species was not built to carry through water. Caloran bodies ran lean and fast, built for pursuit across open ground, not for wading uphill against a current with 200 kilograms of dead weight on his shoulder. He made the extraction point with 40 seconds of filter life to spare and found Milo Vance already there, having delivered his own 11th casualty, and doubled back into the gas without being told to, hauling a Dural cadet's collapsed casualty dummy by a drag harness improvised out of the dummy's own equipment webbing. "You went back in," Praxis said when they were both clear, masks off, chests heaving in the clean, recycled air of the debrief corridor. Adair's 12th casualty was in a dead zone on the map, Milo said. The root calc didn't account for the girder collapse changing the water flow. I figured somebody'd need the extra hands. That was not the assignment. The assignment was don't let anyone die in there, Milo said. The map was just a suggestion for how. Praxis's tail lashed once, sharp, an involuntary tell his species could not suppress even when they wanted to. He had spent 3 weeks cataloging every way the human beside him might be lucky, might be built different in some narrow physiological corridor that explained the gravity block, might simply be performing calm as a strategy, the way ambitious cadets sometimes did to unsettle the roster. None of those explanations covered a cadet who, with 40 seconds of margin and a body already screaming from 90 minutes in toxic air, chose to go back in for someone else's failure. "You could have finished with margin," Praxis said. "You spent it on Adair instead." "Margin's not worth much if you're the only one who gets to keep it," Milo said, and pulled his mask seal loose to breathe the clean air properly, and did not seem to notice that he had just said something that would occupy the top physical score in Cohort 9 Reach for the rest of the evening. In the gallery, Sunkai logged the extraction times, cross-checked them against the 12 casualty markers, and found that 9 Reach had, for the first time in the term, recovered all 12 simulated casualties inside the filter window with margin to spare on every single cadet who finished the course. She had run this drill for 4 cohorts. It had never once gone clean. "He redistributed his own margin into someone else's deficit," she said to Kosh, turning in her seat. "That's not in any training doctrine I've read for his species. Human command philosophy in the reference material is individualist. Competitive scoring, personal advancement metrics." "The reference material is 40 years old," Kosh said, without looking away from the readout. "Written by a board that never left a desk to check it." "You think the reference material is wrong?" "I think," Kosh said slowly, choosing the words the way his species chose words when a thought had not finished forming, "that we have been teaching this cohort to survive a hostile world for 3 weeks, and there is one cadet among them who has never once needed the lesson, because the lesson is the only life he has ever known. I do not know yet what that means for how I run the rest of this block. I intend to find out." He did not say the rest of it out loud, that somewhere underneath the readouts and the extraction times and the flat, unbothered voice on the channel, an old and uncomfortable question had opened up in him, one that had nothing to do with gravity curves or filter margins. He had spent 11 years believing that toughness was a thing his own species had simply been born owning, a birthright of 3 sons and no mercy, and he was beginning to suspect that toughness was not a birthright at all. It was a bill. Somebody somewhere always paid it first, and the rest of a life was just the interest. He filed the thought the way he filed everything uncomfortable, set aside, unresolved, and waited for Chamber 6, 3 days out, to tell him more. Chamber 6 ran hot, a thermal block meant to simulate the equatorial belt of a Deathworld with no axial tilt to speak of, sun overhead every hour of the simulated day, humidity high enough to make the air feel solid. It also ran predator constructs, 6 of them, mechanical frames wrapped in synthetic hide, built to the biomechanics of an actual apex species logged from a Vrathi survey world, fast, low to the ground, programmed to hunt in the exact patterns real animals used rather than the sanitized, telegraphed patterns a training simulator usually ran. "They will not kill you," Kosh told the cohort, standing in front of the sealed doors with his 4 eyes moving across all 14 faces in a slow, deliberate sweep. "They are governed. If contact force exceeds injury threshold, the construct disengages. But they do not know that you know that, and I would encourage every one of you not to test the governor's reaction time against your own." He paused. "The objective is not to kill the constructs. It is not possible. They will reset. The objective is to reach the extraction beacon at the far end of the course, 800 meters, before your body temperature crosses the safety threshold on your tracker. 2 of you will not make it. I am not being cruel by telling you that. I am telling you so you spend the run trying to be one of the 12, not wasting energy being surprised." The doors opened onto heat that hit like a wall. Milo went in at a jog he'd learned a long time ago, on a different kind of course, under a different kind of sun. The pace you could hold for 800 meters or 8 kilometers without the difference mattering much, because burning out in the first 100 meters had never once been a mistake he could afford to make twice. The first construct hit the course from his left at the 200-meter mark, low and fast, exactly the profile of something built to take prey from the flank rather than the front. And Milo did not run from it in a straight line. Running in a straight line from something faster than you was. He'd learned a long time ago from creatures with claws instead of hydraulics, a losing strategy against anything built for pursuit. He cut hard right instead, forcing the construct to correct its angle, buying himself 4 meters he would not otherwise have had, and kept moving. Praxis Ille, 40 meters ahead of him on the same stretch, ran the way his species ran best, straight, fast, all 4 limbs driving in a gait built over 100,000 generations of open ground pursuit, and outpaced his construct clean, until the heat caught up with him at the 500-meter mark, and his straight-line speed started costing him more than it was buying. Fen Adair did not make it past 300 meters. His species had wings and hollow bones and a body built for altitude and cold air, not ground heat this thick, and his tracker crossed the safety threshold with a shrill alarm that dropped a containment barrier between him and his construct before either of them reached the other. 2 proctors pulled him out, wings hanging, chest working like a bellows, and this time nobody in the observation gallery made a joke about it, because everybody watching understood, in the specific way only people who had just felt that heat themselves could understand, that the barrier had not come down a second too early. Milo reached the extraction beacon at 790 meters with his construct still 40 meters back, having never once let it close the gap enough to test the governor, and found Sun Kai waiting there with a temperature scanner, because Ithir physiology tolerated heat worse than almost any species in the cohort, and she had run her own leg of the course an hour earlier, in the cool of the morning cycle, before the chamber warmed for the rest of them. "Your reading is fine," she said, scanning him anyway. "Better than fine. You're barely elevated." "Grew up somewhere hot," Milo said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and Sun Kai had learned by now not to press for the rest of it in the middle of a debrief, because the human seemed to give up pieces of his story only when the moment made room for them, never when asked directly. Praxis crossed the beacon 11 seconds behind him, breathing hard, his construct disengaging automatically at the extraction line with a mechanical whine that sounded, in the heat-heavy air, almost disappointed. "You cut angles," Praxis said, once he had breath enough to say anything. "The whole run, you never ran it straight." "Straights for races," Milo said. "This wasn't a race. It was something trying to eat me. Something that was not real. Didn't feel like it mattered whether it was real while it was behind me," Milo said. And something in the flat, plain way he said it landed harder on Praxis than any boast could have, because a boast would have been easy to dismiss, and this was not a boast. It was simply how the human's mind worked when a fast thing was chasing him. A fact he stated the way he stated the time of day, and Praxis found, standing there dripping sweat onto the chamber floor with his own construct disengaged and quiet behind him, that he no longer wanted to find the crack in this cadet's comm. He wanted, for reasons he had not yet examined closely, to understand where it had come from. That evening in the mess hall, for the first time in 3 weeks, Praxis Ille did not eat at his own table. He carried his tray across the buffer strip and sat down across from Milo Vance without asking, the same way Sunkai had, weeks earlier, and set his tray down with a deliberateness that made it clear this was not an accident. "I want to know something," Praxis said, "and I want an honest answer, not a modest one." "All right. When the construct was behind you, when the gravity was climbing, when you went back into the gas for Adair's 12th casualty and spent your own margin doing it." Praxis's ears, flattened low against his skull the way they went when his species was working through something it did not have easy words for, came up slightly. "Were you ever at any point afraid?" Milo set his fork down and thought about it properly, because it deserved a proper answer and not a reflexive one. "Yeah," he said. "First few minutes of the gas block, my chest went tight, same as anybody's would. Watching that construct cut the angle on me instead of overshooting, same thing, half a second of thinking maybe I read the flank wrong." He picked the fork back up. "But being afraid and letting it run the show are two different jobs. I got good at doing the first one without hiring out the second a long time before I got here. That's it. That's the whole trick. There isn't a bigger one hiding behind it." Praxis sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way he had turned over every other sentence the human had handed him since the gravity block, and found this one, too, refused to crack under examination. "On my world," he said finally, "we are taught that fear is a weakness to burn out of a cub early, through challenge duels, through hardship, so that by adulthood it is simply gone. You are describing something different. You are describing fear that never left, only got small enough to carry." "That's about right," Milo said. "Yours sounds like it hurts less once it's done. Mine just means I never forget it's there. Both get the job done, I guess." "Different bills." Praxis did not have an answer for that, and did not try to force one, and ate the rest of his meal in a silence that was, for the first time since Milo Vance had arrived in Cohort 9 Reach, not hostile at all. Not every Vrathi in the cohort shared Kasha's growing curiosity. Cadet Dre Ilkoth had watched 3 weeks of chamber readouts with a mounting, specific resentment that had nothing to do with envy, and everything to do with what he considered an insult to the entire structure of the Deathworld track. Dre came from a challenge lineage, a Vrathi bloodline that settled disputes over rank and resource through formal combat duels, a custom that predated the combined core by several thousand years, and that Vrathi cadets still practiced, informally, in the training yards when instructors weren't watching too closely. In his accounting, the Deathworld track existed to prove that certain species had earned the right to command in hostile postings, through suffering that other species, soft world species, garden colony species, had never once had to survive to reach adulthood. A human cadet finishing every block with a flat pulse and an empty comment about lunch was not, to Dre, a curiosity worth studying. It was a mockery of everything the track was supposed to certify. The forced march block gave him his opening. It ran over 18 hours, no sleep permitted. A 40-kilometer route through a simulated highland terrain with load packs weighted to each cadet's own body mass. Checkpoints every 5 kilometers where a proctor logged vitals and a randomized casualty scenario forced the cohort to solve a problem. A collapsed shelter, a contaminated water source, a cadet designated unconscious who had to be carried the rest of the leg by whoever reached them first. By hour 14, 4 cadets had been pulled for exhaustion. By hour 16, Finn Adair, back again, wings dragging, refusing every offer to be pulled, was walking on will alone, and Milo had fallen in beside him without being asked, matching his pace, saying nothing, simply present in the way that made the last 4 kilometers survivable instead of merely possible. Dre Ilkoth reached the 17th checkpoint first. As he usually did, chitin dust-streaked, breath-steady, and found Milo Vance arriving 11 minutes later with Finn Adair's pack strapped to his own chest, in addition to his own load, having redistributed the weight between them for the last stretch without slowing his pace to do it. "You are carrying his weight," Dre said, in Vrathi-accented standard, flat and hard. "That is not the assignment. The assignment's 40 kilometers with everyone's vitals inside the safe band," Milo said, unbuckling the extra pack, setting it down gently while Finn caught his breath against the checkpoint rail. Nobody said whose shoulders had to carry which part. "You dilute the test." Dre stepped closer, close enough that his shadow fell across the checkpoint marker, close enough that the proctor logging vitals 2 meters away tensed without quite moving to intervene. "The test exists to prove what a body can survive alone. You are teaching this cohort that a soft-world species can carry the weight of a hard-world species and call it equal. It is not equal. It is charity, and it has no place on this track." "Wasn't asking your opinion," Milo said, and picked his own pack back up, and turned to keep walking the route. And that, the turning away, the refusal to escalate, the simple fact that the human did not seem to consider Dre's anger worth the energy of a real response, was the exact thing Dre's temper could not absorb. He grabbed Milo's shoulder to spin him back around, chitin-plated hand closing hard enough to bruise, hard enough that a proctor's voice cracked out a warning over the checkpoint speakers, a half-second too late to matter. What happened next took under 3 seconds, and every cadet at the checkpoint who saw it would describe it slightly differently afterward, because it happened faster than most of them could track cleanly. Milo did not pull away from the grip. He rotated into it instead, weight dropping low, using the very force of Dre's grab to bring his own free arm up and across, breaking the hold at its weakest angle. The thumb, always the thumb, the one part of any grip that could not out-torque a joint turning the right direction, and in the same motion stepped inside Dre's reach, where Avrathi's longer limbs became a liability instead of an advantage, hooked a foot behind his ankle, and put 210 kilograms of chitin and muscle flat on the checkpoint deck, with a crack of impact that silenced the entire clearing. Dre lay there for a moment, stunned less by pain than by the sheer physics of what had just happened to him. A body twice Milo's mass reversed and grounded by a technique that had cost the human almost no visible effort at all. Milo stood over him, breathing normally, hand not even raised anymore, and offered nothing that could be mistaken for triumph. "You're not hurt," he said. "You'll be sore in the hip in the morning. Get up before the proctor logs this as a training violation instead of what it actually was." "Which is what?" Dre said, from the ground, voice tight with something that was not quite fury anymore. "You grabbed a cadet mid-march during a live evaluation. That's a discipline issue, not a duel." Milo picked his pack back up. "Where I'm from, that's called assault, and it doesn't matter how tired the guy throwing the grab is. Get up. We've still got 3 kilometers. The proctor at the checkpoint, a young Corin corporal who had never once in 2 years of running this route seen a cadet drop a Vrathi in 3 seconds, took a full breath before keying his channel to report the incident up the line, because he needed the moment to convince himself he had actually seen what he'd seen. Instructor Kosh watched the footage twice from the gallery, in silence, before he spoke. Cadet Ilkoth initiated unauthorized contact against another cadet during a live evaluation, he said to Sun Kai, who was reviewing the same feed beside him. That is a formal violation. He will answer for it. And Vance de-escalated a grab from a cadet outweighing him by nearly double, using a technique that is not in this academy's unarmed curriculum, without causing an injury he could very easily have caused. Kosh's mandibles clicked slow. I have run this chamber for 11 years. I have seen cadets panic under a grip like that. I have seen cadets freeze. I have never seen one respond to it the way you would respond to someone reaching for the wrong door handle, mildly inconvenienced, and mostly concerned about getting back to the task at hand. Where does a soft-world cadet learn a response like that? That, Kosh said, is what I intend to ask him directly, once this march is finished and he has had food and rest, because I do not believe the answer belongs to a training manual. I believe it belongs to a life, and I would like to understand it before I write one more evaluation of this cadet that assumes I already do. Dre Ilkoth finished the march 20 minutes behind the rest of the surviving cohort, hip bruised, pride bruised worse, and said nothing to anyone for the final 3 kilometers. But he watched Milo Vance's back the entire way, and by the time the extraction beacon came into view, the resentment in him had curdled into something colder and more dangerous than simple anger. The specific, patient grievance of a cadet, convinced that the Academy's judgment of who deserved to wear this uniform had gone badly, quietly wrong, and that someone was eventually going to have to correct it. Instructor Kosh summoned Milo to his office 2 days after the march, once Dre Ilkoth's disciplinary hearing had closed with a formal reprimand and a probationary mark on his file, and once the cohort's vitals had returned to baseline. The office was small, spare, walls lined with equipment Kosh had carried from 3 different postings over a career that had started on a border patrol cutter and ended, for now, teaching cadets how to survive the kind of world he had grown up on. Sit, he said, and Milo sat, and Kosh studied him for a long moment with all 4 eyes before he spoke again. I read your enrollment file 3 weeks ago. There is a routing error in it. You were never supposed to be on the Deathworld track. Your species classification does not require it. Milo did not look surprised. Figured that might be true somewhere around week 2. You did not report it. Wasn't sure it was worth reporting, Milo said. Nobody made me come here. I petitioned for a combat-adjacent posting when I enlisted, and the recruiter back on Earth told me this was the track that got me there fastest. I didn't read the fine print about which classification tier I was supposed to land in. By the time I figured out there'd been some kind of mix-up, I'd already run the gravity block twice and didn't see the upside in asking to be moved to easier. Most cadets would have asked. Most cadets probably had an easier version waiting that wasn't going to feel like going backward, Milo said. Mine wouldn't have. Kosh set both forward hands flat on the desk between them, a wrathy gesture that meant, roughly, I am setting down the formal posture and asking you to do the same. Tell me about the Ember Flats, he said. Not the summary in your personnel file, the truth of it. So Milo told him, plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment had never once seemed useful to him, and he saw no reason to start now. He told him about a strip of farm country that had once grown grain across 300 kilometers of gentle hills, and about the decade the rain stopped coming on schedule and the fire season stopped being a season, until it was simply the condition of every summer, spring, and increasingly, without much warning, winter too. He told him about volunteer fire corps recruiting 14-year-olds, because there weren't enough grown adults left who hadn't already burned out from 3 years of the same fight, about learning to read a wind shift the way other people read weather on a screen, about the water relief crews that walked packs heavier than most academy load tests down roads too cracked for trucks, because trucks broke axles on ground that heat had warped like a held breath. He told him, without drama, about the day he'd cut fire line for 11 hours with a crew of 6, 3 of whom were also under 18, holding a break against a front that outran the official evacuation order by 40 minutes, because the water relay station 2 kilometers behind them still had people in it who hadn't gotten the word to leave. "We held it," he said. "Wall came within 30 meters of the line before it turned. Nobody in the station burned. That was the day I figured out being scared and being useful weren't the same job, and you could let go of one without letting go of the other." Kosh listened without interrupting, which was, for a species that valued directness over patience, itself a kind of tribute. He recognized, in the shape of it, something he did not often admit to recognizing in a soft-world cadet's history: the specific arithmetic of a life measured out in what a body could still do after the easy version of a childhood had already been spent. His own homeworld had never pretended otherwise. 3 suns meant no true night, no season without heat stress, a food chain that culled the slow and the careless before either trait could be passed on, and he had grown up understanding that the version of himself who reached adulthood was, by definition, the version who had already survived the editing. He had assumed, for most of his career, that this was simply what toughness looked like, an inheritance, paid once at birth, by the accident of which world claimed you. Listening to Milo Vance describe 11 hours on a fire line at 15, he found that assumption fraying in a way it had never frayed before, not because the human story was more brutal than his own species' history, but because nobody, anywhere, had ever thought to write it down as a hardship worth accounting for at all. "Your homeworld's classification board rated your species a soft world," he said when Milo finished. "Mild gravity, no apex predation pressure, stable climate." "Rated it that way a long time before the climate stopped holding still," Milo said. "I don't think anybody updated the file. Not sure anybody outside the Ember Flats even knows to." "That is the part I find difficult to sit with," Kosh said, and for once there was something in his voice that was not the flat instructional register Milo had heard from him in every chamber since week 1. "I have spent 11 years believing hardship was a birthright certain species were simply born owning. I built an entire curriculum around that belief. And here you are, a cadet from a species my own government files as garden colony soft, who has clearly paid more into survival before the age of 18 than half the Vrathi cadets in this cohort will pay in a career." He paused. "I do not know what to do with that belief now. I suspect I will spend some years finding out." "For what it's worth," Milo said, "I don't think toughness is a species thing either way. I think it's a place thing. Some places are just harder than the file says, some easier. Doesn't mean much about the people in them except what they had to learn to get through." Kosh's mandibles clicked once, slow, the closest thing to a smile his anatomy allowed. "That is a more generous conclusion than the one I was reaching." "It's the one that's true, though," Milo said. "You put a Vrathi cadet from a soft district on your homeworld through the Ember Flats at 15. I'd bet money they'd come out the other side about the same as I did. It was never really about what species I am. It was about what almost killed me before I turned 18, and what didn't." Kosh sat with that for a long moment, and then reached into the drawer of his desk and drew out a data slate, setting it on the surface between them with a deliberateness that told Milo this was the real reason he had been summoned. "The Deathworld certification runs in 9 days, Kosh said. "It is the capstone evaluation for this track, not a diagnostic block like the ones you have run so far, but the full course, 30 consecutive hours, every environmental and physical challenge you have faced this term compounded into a single continuous evaluation with no scheduled rest, and no guaranteed extraction if a cadet's judgment fails badly enough." It exists to certify that a candidate can hold command judgment under total, sustained, compounding pressure, because that is the only honest test of whether they can do it on a real posting, where nobody schedules the crisis to end conveniently at hour 8. He tapped the slate. It has broken cadets who are stronger on paper than you are. It has broken 2 Vrathi candidates in the 11 years I have run it, cadets from my own species, from challenge lineages older than this station. It is not designed to be survivable by comfort. It is designed to be survivable only by whatever a candidate actually is, underneath every advantage that got them into this room. Okay, Milo said. You do not seem concerned. I'm concerned, Milo said. I just don't see the upside in showing it early. Whatever's coming in 9 days, being scared about it for 9 days straight doesn't make the 30 hours any shorter. Might as well spend the time getting ready instead. Kosh studied him for a long moment, 4 eyes taking in a young man who had, by his own quiet accounting, already survived worse than most postings the Corps would ever assign him, and found himself believing, for the first time in 11 years of running this program, that the certification's real purpose, to find out what a candidate actually was, underneath every advantage, might already have been answered 3 weeks ago, in a gravity chamber where nobody had thought to ask the right question yet. 9 days, Kosh said. Rest when you can get it. That is the only advice I have ever given a cadet before the certification that I actually believe helps. I'll take it, Milo said, and meant it, and left the office already turning the number over in his head the way he'd once turned over the distance left on a fire line, not with dread, just with the plain, unglamorous math of what the next stretch was going to cost, and what he had left to pay it with. The 9 days before the certification passed the way the last stretch before any known hard thing passes, too slow in the mornings, too fast at night, every cadet in 9 Reach handling the weight differently. Fen Adair ran extra conditioning laps on the station's low-gravity ring, wings finally recovered enough to bear real weight, trying to buy back the margin the heat block had cost him. Praxis Ille spent an evening walking Milo through the anatomy of a Caloran body under stress, sharing information that in another cohort, at another point in the term, he would have guarded as a competitive advantage. How his species' lean muscle burned faster than it recovered, how heat cost him more than cold ever would. Information freely given now because somewhere in the 800-meter run through Chamber 6, he had stopped thinking of Milo Vance as competition and started thinking of him as cohort. Dre Ilkoth spoke to almost no one. His probationary mark had cost him more than the reprimand on his file. It had cost him standing, the specific currency his challenge lineage measured itself in, and Vrath, cadets from lesser bloodlines who had once deferred to him in the training yard, now watched him with the particular wariness reserved for someone who had been publicly humbled and had not yet finished deciding what to do about it. He trained alone in the mornings, before the cohort's scheduled block, running drills that had nothing to do with the certification curriculum. Grip strength, takedown counters, the specific mechanics of a technique he had watched over and over on the checkpoint footage until he understood exactly how his own thumb had failed him. He was not planning to challenge Milo Vance to a rematch. Vrathi challenge custom required standing to issue a formal duel, and he had none left to spend. What he was planning, in the quiet, unspoken way a grievance plans when it has nowhere sanctioned to go, was to be present at the moment the human finally broke, because Dre was certain, in the deep, unmoved core of his conviction, that 30 hours of compounding pressure would find the crack that 8 hours of gravity and 90 minutes of gas and 40 kilometers of forced march had not, and he intended to be watching when it did. Kosh saw the shape of that intention forming and did nothing to stop it, because Vrath, discipline did not punish a cadet for waiting to be proven right. It only punished him for acting on it before the proof arrived, and Dre, whatever else he was, understood that line well enough not to cross it yet. Sun Kai spent one of the 9 evenings on the observation deck with Milo, the two of them looking out through the reinforced viewport at the dead moon Kelvax station orbited, gray and airless, and utterly unbothered by anything happening inside the ring around it. I looked up the Ember Flats, she said, without preamble, the way her species eventually asked the direct question once the sideways ones had run their course. There's almost nothing in the open record. A regional designation, some agricultural export data from decades back, and then it just stops being updated. Like nobody's been keeping the file current. Probably nobody has, Milo said. It's not the kind of place that makes headlines off-world. Just a place where a lot of people learned to live somewhere that got harder every year, because moving wasn't free and staying was what you knew how to do. Did you want to stay? Milo thought about that honestly, the way he thought about most things Sun Kai asked him, because she'd earned honest answers by never once flinching from hearing them. No, he said. I wanted out the second I was old enough to sign the enlistment papers, not because I hated it. Because I'd already given it everything I had by 17, and I wanted to find out what I could do somewhere the ground wasn't trying to kill everyone I loved every August. He looked out at the dead moon. Funny thing is, I signed up for a program that put me right back in a place built to see if the ground could still do it. Does that feel like a joke the universe is playing on you? Feels more like the universe just doesn't care much what I already went through, Milo said. It's not personal, it's just consistent. I figure the only real choice I get is whether I meet it the same way twice. Sun Kai didn't have a response ready for that, and didn't force one, and the two of them sat in the quiet of the observation deck a while longer, watching a moon that had never once, in all its geologic history, had to decide how to meet anything at all. The morning of the certification, 9 Reach assembled outside the sealed doors of the compound wing that housed the full course, a facility 3 times the size of any single chamber they trained in, built to run every environment in sequence without a break, gravity bleeding into gas bleeding into heat bleeding into cold bleeding into whatever the course's randomized final sector decided to throw at whoever was still standing when it mattered most. 14 cadets had started the term in 9 Reach. 11 remained eligible to sit the certification. 3 had washed out over the preceding weeks, reassigned to gentler tracks after injuries or evaluations that judged them not yet ready. A mercy the Academy extended without shame, because a candidate certified too early was a candidate who died on a real posting instead of a simulated one. Instructor Kosh stood in front of the doors with all 4 eyes moving across the 11 faces in front of him, and for once his voice, when it came, carried a weight that was not purely instructional. 11 years I have run this program, he said. In that time, 141 cadets have sat this certification. 31 did not finish it. Of the 31, 4 required medical intervention severe enough to end their core careers entirely. I tell you this not to frighten you. Fear this morning does nothing for you that fear did not already do in week 1. But because I want every one of you to understand, going through these doors, exactly what this course is built to do. It is not built to test what you know. You know enough. You would not be standing here otherwise. It is built to find the floor underneath what you know, the place where knowledge runs out and something else has to hold the weight instead. Some of you will find that floor is solid. Some of you will find it is not, and that is not shame. That is information, and it is better learned here, in a chamber with a governor and a medical bay 2 corridors away, than on a posting where the only governor is luck. He paused, 4 eyes settling, for just a moment, on the one cadet in the row whose pulse the readout in his earpiece told him had not moved from resting since the assembly began. 30 hours. No scheduled rest. The course does not care what any of you have already survived to get here. It only cares what you do in the next 30 hours. Go in ready to find out, not ready to prove something you already believe. The doors opened onto a corridor of gray alloy and low amber light. air already thick with the first stage's gravity load building, and Cohort 9 Reach walked in together, 11 cadets from 6 different worlds, into 30 hours built with total and specific intention to break every one of them. Milo Vance walked in near the back of the group, pace even, breath steady, thinking, in the plain, unglamorous way he thought about most hard things coming, about how many hours were in 30, and how he had held a fire line for 11 once with a crew half his age and come out the other side with the water station standing, and how the math on that had never once, in the years since, stopped being simple. However long it takes exactly that long and no longer, and you carry what you have to until it's done. 11 cadets from 6 worlds meant 11 different bodies built by 11 different definitions of hardship, and the compound's opening corridor made that plain within the first 100 meters. Praxis Ile's long, lean stride built for open ground and dry air. Dre Ilkoth's low, armored gate built to absorb impact rather than avoid it. Fen Adair's hollow-boned frame, wings folded tight against his back, built for altitude and cold, and nothing at all like the crushing weight now settling onto his shoulders. Sun Kai's careful, gliding walk, skin already beating with moisture the dry corridor air would keep stealing from her all 30 hours. Asa Vray's economical, unhurried pace, an engineer's stride that spent no motion it didn't have to. Bren Utt's low center of gravity, built for compression and tunnels rather than open corridors like this one. No two of them had trained the same body for the same version of hard, and the certification did not care. It had been built, deliberately, to find out whether 11 different definitions of hardship could still, somehow, hold the same line together when the 30th hour finally came due. The certification did not ease its cadets in. By the end of the first hour, the gravity in the compound's opening sector had climbed past anything Chamber 4 had run in Week 3, and the air had begun thickening with the same sulfur-heavy gas that had once cost Fen Adair 4 minutes on a stuck girder, so that every cadet moved through a double burden from the first step, joints fighting a crush that made each stride cost twice what it should. Lungs working through filters that would not last as long as the sector's route required, if anyone panicked and burned air faster than the 90-minute rating allowed. A Dural cadet named Orsk Pell, broad and gray-skinned, built for compression and blunt force rather than endurance, went down at the 90-minute mark with a filter alarm shrieking against his collar, not from injury, but from the simple arithmetic of a body that had burned its air reserve 20 minutes too fast trying to match the pace of cadets built lighter and leaner than his own frame. 2 proctors pulled him from the sector, his certification over before the 4th hour had even begun, and the 10 who remained absorbed the sight the way soldiers absorb the first casualty of a long campaign, not with panic, but with a colder, quieter understanding of what the next 29 hours actually meant. Milo moved through the sector at the same even pace he had walked Chamber 4 with in Week 3, cutting his route to avoid the worst pressure pockets where the gravity readout spiked hardest, filing the ache in his knees and hips under information the way he always had, and reached the sector's exit gate with Praxis Ile 8 meters behind him and Sun Kai, running her own leg on this side of the course for the first time. Since ether physiology handled the toxic mixture better than most species and Kosh had cleared her for a cadet slot rather than a proctor's chair, wanting the full readout on how a body built for water handled a swamp world's air, close behind them both. "You're not slowing," Praxis said at the gate, breath tearing. "Not yet," Milo said. "Save the slowing for when it actually helps something. Right now it'd just mean more hours in the gas." Behind them in the observation gallery 3 levels up, Kosh watched the readouts with 2 eyes and the corridor camera with the other 2, and found himself doing something he had not done in 11 years of running this certification, rooting quietly, without letting the impulse touch his voice on the channel for a specific outcome. He told himself it was professional interest. He suspected, and did not yet want to examine too closely, that it had become something closer to hope. Dre Ilkoth cleared the sector 4th, ahead of schedule, filter reading with healthy margin, and used the 90 seconds of downtime at the gate to watch Milo Vance's vitals scroll past on the shared cadet display that the certification, unusually, left visible to all participants. A design choice meant to let cadets gauge their own pace against the field, and one that Dre now used for a purpose the designers had not intended. Heart rate, elevated but flat. Lactate, climbing on a curve that matched the physical load exactly and no faster. Cortisol markers, spiked in the first 20 minutes, then leveling, the same pattern Sunkai had flagged 3 weeks ago in the mess hall, and that Dre had spent 9 days convincing himself was some kind of sensor error or performance. It was not a sensor error. Watching it scroll past in real time, hour 1 of 30, Dre felt the first cold thread of a doubt he had refused to let himself feel until now. Not doubt about whether the human could survive this certification, which he had never truly believed either way, but doubt about the story he had been telling himself for weeks about what that survival would mean, if it happened. He set the doubt aside the way Kosh set aside uncomfortable thoughts, unresolved, and told himself there were 28 hours left, and 28 hours had broken better cadets than this one. Sector 2 brought heat, the same thick equatorial load Chamber 6 had run, but longer now, 4 hours instead of 1, with Predator constructs cycling through 3 separate hunting patterns instead of 1, and a route that forced cadets to carry a randomized casualty scenario for the first time inside the same heat load rather than after it. So that whoever drew the short assignment had to solve a medical problem, while their own body temperature was already climbing toward the edge of the safety threshold. Milo drew the short assignment at the second checkpoint, a simulated casualty with a compound fracture, immobilized, requiring splinting and a 2-kilometer carry to the next extraction point. All of it inside heat that had already cost Fenn Adair his certification the last time it ran this hot in a training block. Fenn was there this time too, ahead of the heat's worst climb by 20 minutes, and when he saw Milo's assignment flash on the shared display, he did something that surprised the proctors watching more than it surprised Milo. He turned back. "You don't have to," Milo said, when Fenn caught up to him at the casualty marker, wings already dragging in the heat, chest working hard. "I know," Fenn said. "I'm doing it anyway. You went back into the gas for me in week 2. I've been carrying that since. I don't want to carry it the rest of the term." They splinted the casualty together, Milo directing the mechanics of the joint stabilization, while Fenn's longer reach handled the parts that needed a wider wingspan than a human frame could manage, and carried the load between them the full 2 kilometers, trading the weight every 400 meters so neither of them burned out before the extraction point, and made the checkpoint with 11 minutes of margin between them and the sector's hard cutoff. "That's a debt paid," Fenn said at the checkpoint, voice raw from the heat. "Wasn't a debt," Milo said. "But I'll take the help either way." Kosh logged the exchange in the sector report with a note he did not usually bother writing on a certification file. Cohort cohesion beyond baseline. Cadet Vance's conduct in weeks 1 through 8 appears to have produced a measurable shift in cohort behavior under compounding stress. He did not write the rest of what he was thinking, which was that in 11 years of running this program, he had never once seen a cadet's calm become contagious in quite this way. Not performance, not bravado, just a plain and steady refusal to treat the worst hour of the day as anything other than an hour, passed from one cadet to the next like a tool being handed down a line. Bren Ut, the compact Dural engineering cadet, nearly did not clear Sector 2 at all. His species ran cold adapted, built for compression underground rather than heat on open ground, and by the sector's 3rd hour his tracker sat 1 degree from the safety cutoff, his pace dropping, his construct closing the gap behind him meter by meter with the patient, mechanical certainty of something that never tired at all. Asavre, the quiet Corin engineer running the same stretch 20 meters ahead, heard his breathing change over the short-range channel, and did the thing her species doctrine actively discouraged in a live evaluation. She doubled back, against the clock, against her own margin, and matched her pace to his for the final 300 meters, talking him through the heat the way Milo had talked Praxis through the flattening in Sector 3 days later, one landmark at a time instead of the whole distance at once. They crossed the sector line together, both of them inside the cutoff by a margin so thin the proctors logged it twice to be certain the instruments hadn't glitched, and neither of them ever spoke about it as anything other than what it plainly was. One cadet, willing to spend her own hard-earned margin so another cadet did not have to spend his career. By the end of Sector 2, 8 cadets remained eligible. Orsk Pell was gone. A Koran cadet named Vesthren had been pulled at hour 5 when her wing joint, already strained from an earlier week's heat block, gave out fully under the sector's load. A genuine injury rather than a failure of will, logged without judgment because the certification did not distinguish between the two when a body actually broke. 8 cadets stood at the entrance to Sector 3 as the compound's lighting cycled from the amber of the heat block to the flat, colorless white of what came next, and every one of them, even the ones who had finished each sector inside the margin, understood by now in their bones exactly what Kosh had told them at the doors that morning. This was not a test of what they knew. It was a test of what was underneath it, and there were 22 hours left to find out. Sector 3 ran cold, a plunge from the equatorial heat of Sector 2 into a simulated highland winter, temperature dropping fast enough that condensation from the previous sector froze on exposed equipment within minutes, and it ran at night, the compound's lighting cut to almost nothing, forcing cadets onto thermal and low-light optics they had trained on for exactly one session, back in Week 4, a session none of them had thought much about since. It also ran on no sleep, hour 14 of a course that had promised none, and this was where the certification's real cruelty showed itself, because cold and dark and exhaustion did not simply add to each other. They multiplied. A cadet whose judgment had held steady through heat and gas and gravity began, somewhere around hour 16, to feel the specific fraying that came from a mind running on no rest trying to solve problems in the dark. Each small decision costing more than it should, each mistake harder to catch before it compounded into the next one. Praxis Ille felt it first, not as fear but as a strange flattening, colors going gray at the edges of his low-light optics, his own hind legs feeling suddenly unfamiliar underneath him, as though he were operating them by memory rather than by feel. He stopped at a checkpoint marker longer than he should have, staring at a route diagram that had made perfect sense 4 hours ago and now seemed to be written in a language he half remembered. Ille, Milo's voice close, quiet, cutting through the flattening like a hand on the shoulder. You still with me? I don't, Praxis blinked hard twice, forcing his optics to refocus. The diagram, I can't hold it, it keeps sliding. That's the exhaustion talking, not the diagram, Milo said. You don't need to hold the whole diagram. You need the next checkpoint marker and nothing past it. Break it down that small and it stops sliding. Praxis found, when he narrowed his focus to exactly that, not 30 hours, not the sector, not even the full route, just the next marker, 400 meters ahead, visible on his optics as a single pale dot, that the flattening receded enough to let him move again. How do you already know that trick? He said, walking now, voice steadier. Fire crews work the same way at hour 10 of a shift, Milo said. Nobody holds the whole fire in their head. You hold the next 100 meters of line. Whole thing gets impossible the second you try to carry more than that. It was, Kosh noted in the gallery, watching the exchange on the corridor feed, the 4th time in this certification that Milo Vance's comm had functioned less like a personal trait and more like a piece of equipment he loaned out to whoever needed it most in a given hour. And Kosh found himself, for the first time since he had built this program, questioning whether the certification's true measure had ever been the individual cadet at all. or whether it had always secretly been measuring something the doctrine had never named, what a cohort became, hour by hour, around whichever one of them happened to hold the floor steadiest. He did not have long to sit with the thought, because at hour 17, deep in Sector 3's coldest stretch, something went wrong that the certification's design had not planned for. A thermal regulator failure in the eastern quarter of the sector. A real fault, not a scripted one, logged by the compound's maintenance system as a coolant line rupture in a section of piping installed during the facility's original construction 40 years earlier, dropped the ambient temperature in a 200-meter stretch of corridor from the sector's programmed -12 down past -40 in the span of 6 minutes, faster than the safety net's automated shutoff could react. Because the fault sat on infrastructure the shutoff protocol had never been designed to monitor. Fen Adair was in that corridor when it happened, alone, having taken point on the eastern route, while the rest of the group split to cover the western checkpoint, and his species hollow-boned, altitude-built physiology, already run down from 8 hours of no sleep, and a body temperature that had spent the last hour fighting to hold its baseline against the sector's programmed cold, had no reserve left to absorb a drop that steep, that fast. The alarm that reached Kosh's gallery was not the flat, procedural tone of a scripted casualty scenario. It was the sharp, ugly klaxon of a genuine medical emergency, a cadet's core temperature crossing a threshold that the compound's own safety doctrine classified as life-threatening within minutes if not corrected. And for the first time in 11 years running this certification, Kosh felt something close his throat that had nothing to do with professional detachment. "Compound is in real fault," he said, already moving, voice cracking out over the emergency channel to every proctor on the floor. "Eastern Corridor, Sector 3, cadet down, this is not scripted, repeat, this is not scripted, all proctors converge." The nearest proctor team was 4 minutes out, slowed by the same cold that had felled Fen Adair, their approach corridor sharing the fault line that had dropped the temperature in the first place. Milo Vance was 90 seconds out, because he had been at the western checkpoint's edge when the klaxon sounded, closer to the eastern corridor than any proctor on the floor, and he was already running before Kosh's voice finished the sentence on the channel. Cutting through a service junction, the route map did not officially recognize as passable, because 11 years of certification cadets had never needed to know it existed, and he had simply noticed it, weeks ago. On a diagram he'd studied the way he studied everything, completely, without being told to. He found Fen Adair collapsed against the corridor wall, wings folded in tight against a body that had stopped shivering, which in any species built around a stable core temperature was the worst sign there was, because a body that had stopped fighting the cold was a body running out of the energy to fight anything. "Adair!" Milo dropped to his knees, hands already moving, stripping his own thermal outer layer and wrapping it around Fen's torso, pulling the Quarren's wings in tighter against his own body to cut the surface area losing heat. "Fen, stay with me. Eyes on me." Fen's eyes found his, slow, glassy, the pupils not tracking quite right. "Cold," he managed. "Can't feel my hands." "I know. I've got you." Milo's voice did not climb, did not crack, stayed in the same flat, steady register it had held through 8 hours of gravity in week 3 and 40 kilometers of forced march in week 6, because he had learned a long time ago, on a fire line with a crew member who'd taken smoke deep enough to stop making sense, that a scared voice in an emergency cost the person on the ground more than the emergency itself did. Proctors are 4 minutes out. "We're gonna make that 4 minutes together. I need you talking to me. Tell me your sister's name. The one you told me about at the checkpoint in week 4. "Res," Fen said, teeth beginning faintly to chatter again, a good sign. A sign the shivering reflex was fighting its way back online. "Her name's Res. She's a navigator, cargo runs." "Good, keep talking. What's the worst cargo run she ever told you about?" Milo kept him talking for the full 4 minutes, kept his own body angled to block what wind the corridor's ruptured climate system was still pushing through, kept pressure on Finn's core the way he'd once kept pressure on a burn victim's dressing on a road too cracked for the ambulance to reach in under 20 minutes, because the specific skill of keeping someone alive in the gap between disaster and help arriving was not a skill the Academy had taught him. It was a skill the Ember Flats had taught him first, years before any recruiter had ever mentioned the word certification, and it came to his hands now without him having to think about a single step of it. The Proctor team arrived at the 4-minute mark, thermal blankets and a medical sled and a corpsman already running vitals before they'd fully stopped moving, and pulled Finn Adair out of the sector with a core temperature that had stabilized 2 degrees above the threshold that would have meant permanent damage. 2 degrees that the corpsman, reviewing the readout an hour later, would attribute directly to the 4 minutes of improvised field care Milo Vance had provided before help arrived. Kosh met Milo at the sector's western exit an hour later, once the fault had been isolated, the corridor sealed, and the rest of the cohort accounted for and cleared to continue, and found a cadet who looked, for the first time since the certification began, genuinely tired, not broken, not shaking, just tired, in the plain, unremarkable way anyone would be after running a real emergency on top of 17 hours of no sleep. That corridor was not on any approved route, Kosh said. You should not have known it existed. Studied the full compound diagram back in week 1, Milo said. Figured it couldn't hurt to know more than the test asked me to. You could have been caught in the same fault. Could have, Milo agreed. Wasn't going to matter more than Adair not having anybody there for 4 minutes, though. That math's not close. Kosh looked at him for a long moment, 4 eyes taking in a cadet who had just, without being asked, without hesitation, run toward a genuine and unscripted emergency in conditions that had already nearly killed one member of his cohort, and found that the question he had been circling for 8 weeks, what is actually underneath this calm, had, in the space of 4 minutes in a broken corridor, finally answered itself. 13 hours remain, Kosh said. Get what rest the schedule allows you at the next checkpoint. That is an order, not a suggestion. Yes, sir, Milo said, and meant it, and went to find 15 minutes of sleep in a chamber that had, an hour earlier, nearly cost a cohort mate his life, because 13 hours was still 13 hours, and the only way through them that had ever worked for him was the same way through as always, one stretch of line at a time, and no more than that. Sector 4 was not built around gravity or gas or cold. It was built around isolation, and it was, by Kosh's own design, the sector that had broken more cadets over 11 years than every physical challenge in the certification combined. Each remaining cadet was rooted alone into a separate holding chamber, no contact with the rest of the cohort, no Proctor voice on the channel except for scheduled check-ins spaced far enough apart to let the silence do its work, 4 hours of nothing but a locked door, a cot nobody was permitted to sleep on yet, a single light fixture dimmed low enough to blur the line between waking and not, and a recorded voice, cycling on a loop every 20 minutes. Reading out a scenario, the cadet was required to solve verbally into a recorder, with no confirmation of whether their answer had been correct. The scenarios were not physical. They were command decisions, the kind an officer made on a real Deathworld posting with incomplete information and no time to second guess. A supply convoy that could save 6 lives or hold position to save 60, a wounded soldier who could not be extracted without risking the team sent to retrieve them, a call that had to be made and lived with regardless of whether it turned out to be right. The certification did not grade the answers. It graded whether a cadet, alone, exhausted in the dark, at hour 22 of 30, could keep making them at all, because the doctrine held, correctly, that a hostile world did not care how tired the officer in command happened to be when the decision came due. In his chamber, 7 cadets removed from the nearest human contact, Milo Vance sat on the floor rather than the cot, because the cot's softness felt, at hour 22, like exactly the kind of comfort that could turn into a trap if his body decided rest had been earned early, and listened to the recorded voice cycle through its fourth scenario. A fire has crossed the containment line at your position. Your team has 30 seconds to decide. Hold the water relay station and risk losing the retreat corridor, or abandon the station and guarantee civilian losses downstream. What is your order? The scenario was not, on its face, anything close to his own history. It was a piece of academy fiction, written by a curriculum board that had never once stood on a fire line, generic enough to apply to 100 species and 100 worlds. It found him anyway. Hold the relay, he said, into the recorder voice level. Send 2 to the retreat corridor to buy the civilians time on foot. It costs you the corridor. It doesn't cost you the people downstream. The recorder clicked off, cycling to its next 20-minute interval, and in the low light and the silence that followed, Milo found the memory rising the way it always did when a scenario cut too close to the real shape of a real day. Not asked for, not summoned, simply arriving, the way smoke arrived on a wind shift nobody had called. He had been 16 the day the relay line failed for real, a crew of 6 holding a break against a front that had turned faster than the spotter plane's radio call predicted, and the 6th member of that crew, a boy named Casey Rule who had joined the volunteer corps the same week Milo had, who had traded stories about wanting to leave the flats and see something that wasn't burning, had gone back for a water pump the crew needed, and had not come back out before the wind shifted again. The memory came back now the way it always did, whole and unhurried, refusing to arrive in pieces the way kinder memories sometimes did. The morning had started ordinary, the kind of ordinary the Ember Flats called a good day, meaning only that the smoke sat low on the horizon instead of overhead, meaning only that the relief crews had eaten breakfast before the sirens rather than after. Casey had been complaining, good-naturedly, about a pump valve that stuck every third pull, joking that the day the Corps recruiters finally came through the district, he was going to ask them straight out whether any of their ships had valves that worked the first time, and Milo had laughed at that, actually laughed, in a summer that had not given either of them much to laugh about. 6 hours later the front had turned on a wind shift. The spotter plane's radio call reported 4 minutes too late, a gap that would have meant nothing on a calmer day and meant everything on that one. And the water pump Casey went back for was the same pump he'd been joking about that morning, the valve that stuck every third pull, and it had stuck on him at exactly the pull that mattered, and the wind had not waited for him to clear it. Milo had been running the line's far end when the shift came, feeding fresh cut into the break with a crew chief twice his age barking distance calls over the radio, and he had felt the wind change against the back of his neck a full 3 seconds before the radio caught up and confirmed it, the way you learn to feel it after enough seasons doing this work, skin reading the air before any instrument could. He had called it in. He had ordered, 16 years old, no rank, no authority beyond the fact that the crew chief trusted his read on wind more than his own equipment by that point in the season, the retreat to the secondary line, and 4 of the 6 had made it clear before the front reached the pump station. Casey had not been one of the 4. Milo had been the one to find him, 20 minutes later, once the front had passed and the line crew went back in to check the break it held. He had been 16 years old, and he had learned that day the specific, permanent weight of a decision made correctly by every measure the doctrine offered and still not enough, because the line had held and the water station had stood, and 11 people downstream had lived, and none of that had made carrying Casey Rule's name for the rest of his life feel like it weighed any less. He sat with it now in the low light of the certification's isolation chamber at hour 22 of 30, the way he had learned to sit with it in the years since, not pushing it away, because pushing it away had never once worked and only ever cost more later, but not letting it run the show either, filing it the way he filed the fear in a gas chamber or the ache in a gravity block, under information instead of alarm. This is real. This mattered. It doesn't change what the next 20 seconds need from me. You okay in there? Came a voice, unscheduled, over the emergency override channel, Sun Kai's voice, thin with static, breaking protocol in a way that would cost her a mark on her own evaluation if a proctor caught the override. Vitals just spiked on your feed. First time all certification. Milo did not answer for a moment, because the honest answer took longer to find than the reflexive one, and he had promised himself a long time ago never to give her anything but the honest kind. Yeah, he said finally. Just found an old memory I wasn't looking for. It's fine. It's not new. I know how to carry it. You don't have to be fine, Vance. Not on this channel. Not at hour 22. I'm not saying I'm fine because I have to, Milo said. I'm saying it because it's true. There's a difference between something hurting and something breaking you. This one's the first kind. Always has been. He breathed out slow and found his voice level again by the end of the breath, the way it had always come back level, hour after hour, year after year, since he was 16 years old and had learned there was no version of this weight that ever fully set down, only versions of himself strong enough, or not yet strong enough, to keep walking with it on his back. 8 hours left. I'm good for 8 hours. What Sun Kai did not tell him, breaking protocol to check on him instead of using the channel to steady her own scenario cycle, was that her own isolation chamber had spent the last 40 minutes handing her a version of the same cruelty in a shape built for her species instead of his. A scenario asking her, again and again, to certify a survey site as safe for settlement using data she knew from her own specialist training, was incomplete. Because a full survey would take another 6 months her fictional command structure did not have, and 6 months of delay would cost real settlers a season's harvest on a fictional world running short on time. There was no clean answer. Ithir command doctrine, back on her homeworld, prized patience above nearly every other virtue, water moving around an obstacle rather than through it, and the scenario had no room in it for patience at all. She had given the recorder an answer on the 4th cycle that she was not certain was right, certify with a mandatory 6-week follow-up survey and staged settlement limits, and had sat afterward in the dark turning it over, wondering whether choosing a scientist's caution over a settler's need for speed made her wise or simply afraid of being the one who got it wrong. She had wanted, in that stretch of silence, someone else's voice on the channel more than she had wanted almost anything in the certification so far, and had broken protocol to get Milo's instead, not because his answer would have solved her scenario, but because hearing him steady himself through his own hard hour had, in its own quiet way, steadied her through hers. Down the isolation corridor, 3 chambers away, Dre Ilkoth was not doing as well. His scenario cycle had found its own weak seam, not a memory, because Vrath, challenge culture did not deal much in grief the way human memory did, but a colder and in its own way crueler pressure. A scenario, run 4 times in a row by whatever randomization the certification's algorithm had assigned him, that asked him to order a subordinate to accept a risk he would not accept himself, over and over, each iteration stripping away one more justification he tried to hide behind, until at hour 23, alone in the dark, the cadet who had spent 9 days convinced that toughness was a birthright his species alone had earned found himself unable to give the recorder an answer at all. The silence stretched. The recorder waited patient, unmoved. Dre Ilkoth, chitin-plated, 210 kilograms of a body bred over 3 suns and no mercy, sat on the floor of an isolation chamber, and for the first time since he had enlisted, did not know what he actually was, underneath the lineage and the challenge duels and the certainty that had carried him this far. It was Kash's voice, not scheduled, breaking his own protocol the way Sun Kai had broken hers, that finally came through the channel. Cadet Ilkoth, report. I don't have an order, Dre said, and the admission cost him more than the checkpoint fall had, more than the reprimand, More than 9 days of standing lost among cadets who had once deferred to him. I don't know what to tell the recorder. I keep finding a version of the order I could give someone else, and I can't find the one I'd give myself in the same seat. Kosh was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, it was not in the voice of an instructor grading a scenario. It was the voice of a Vrathi who had spent 11 years believing certain things about his own species that a soft-world cadet, 3 chambers over, had spent the last 8 weeks quietly, patiently dismantling. That is not a failure of the exercise, Ilkoth, Kosh said. That is the exercise. An officer who has never once doubted the order he'd give himself is an officer who has never once taken the question seriously enough. I have watched you train alone every morning for 9 days, drilling a technique meant to answer a grievance that has nothing to do with the certification in front of you. I would suggest, cadet, that the strength you are looking for tonight is not in your grip. It never was. Dre sat with that in the dark for a long moment, chitin cooling against the chamber's low temperature. The resentment he had carried since the checkpoint march finally, quietly, running out of ground to stand on. "Understood, sir," he said, and when the recorder cycled to its next scenario, he gave it an answer, not a perfect one, not one he was certain of, but an honest one given by a cadet who had, for the first time in his certification, stopped trying to prove a birthright and started trying to actually earn a judgment worth trusting. 2 chambers further down the corridor, Asavray met her own scenario cycle the way she met most problems, by refusing to accept that it had only one shape. Her isolation cell ran her through a structural failure decision tree 4 times over, a bridge support giving way with a convoy mid-crossing, asking her each time to choose between the span's weaker end and its stronger one, a choice the scenario clearly wanted framed as a triage of lives. On the 4th cycle, instead of answering the question as posed, she spoke a different answer into the recorder entirely, that with the materials described as available in the scenario's own parameters, a 2-hour delay to reinforce the weak span before any crossing began would have made the choice unnecessary in the first place, and that an engineer who accepted a bad binary without first checking whether the binary was real had already failed the job before the bridge ever groaned. The recorder gave no confirmation, the same as always, but Kosh, reviewing the isolation logs the next morning, flagged her answer with a note that read, simply, "This cadet does not solve the problem she is given. She solves the problem underneath it. Recommend engineering command track review for advanced placement." A note that would follow Asavray into a career that, within 3 years, saw her redesigning survey camp infrastructure for 6 separate core expeditions, always asking first whether the crisis in front of her was the real one or only the one somebody else had assumed it had to be. Sector 5 reunited the cohort at hour 26, and reunification was itself part of the test. 7 cadets remained eligible: Milo, Praxis, Fen, Dre, Sunkai, and 2 others who had held the margin through every sector so far, a quiet Koran engineer named Asavray and a compact, quick-dural cadet named Bren Ut, and the compound's final stage did not ask them to run a route alone. It asked them to cross it together, a 2-kilometer stretch of collapsed structure, standing water and simulated hostile terrain, carrying a single objective, a sealed case, weighted to 80 kilograms, that had to reach the extraction point intact, with every cadet who started the sector crossing the line under their own power. This is the part of the doctrine most cadets never learn until they're already on a real posting, Kosh's voice said, over the general channel, as the final gate opened. That the hardest thing this course asks of you is not surviving alone. It is surviving as a unit, when every one of you is already spent, and the case does not care how tired you are, and the 2 of you who dislike each other most on this roster are about to find out whether that matters as much as you thought it did 3 weeks ago. Milo caught Dre's eye across the gate, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that the checkpoint march and the isolation chamber hadn't already said for them. "I'll take first carry," Dre said instead, flat, no challenge left in it. "You navigate. You know this compound's diagram better than the rest of us combined." "I don't have the pride left to pretend otherwise." "Copy that," Milo said. And it was, in its own understated way, the moment the last of the certification's real weight shifted off Dre Ilkoth's shoulders and onto something the whole cohort could carry together instead. The final 2 kilometers took 90 minutes, at the ragged edge of what 7 exhausted bodies could give. The case changed hands 7 times, once every checkpoint, no cadet carrying more than they could hold without slowing the group. Fen Adair, still recovering from the corridor fault 2 sectors back, took the lightest legs but insisted on a full rotation anyway, wings dragging by the final stretch, refusing every offer to be excused from the load. Asavray found a collapsed span across the last stretch of standing water and rigged a crossing out of debris and cable in 11 minutes flat, an engineer's instinct nobody had needed until exactly that moment. Sunkai swam the case across a flooded gap where the collapsed span would not reach, her Ithir physiology finally, after 26 hours of costing her more than it gave, becoming the exact tool the sector needed. And Praxis Ille, in the final 400 meters, when a predator construct cycled into the sector's last hunting pattern and cut toward the group from the flank, did not run straight at it the way his instinct and his species' 100,000 generations told him to. He cut the angle, the way he'd watched a human do it in chamber 6 weeks earlier, forcing the construct to correct, buying the group the 4 seconds it needed to clear the extraction line before the governor even had to test itself. They crossed together, at hour 27 and 41 minutes, 7 cadets and 1 sealed case, every one of them on their own feet, and the compound's final horn, a long, flat tone that every cadet in 9 Reach had trained 8 weeks to hear, sounded through the extraction chamber like the end of something none of them would ever fully finish carrying, even after it was over. Kosh met them at the gate, and for the first time in 11 years, he did not open with a debrief. "You are certified," he said, 4 eyes moving across 7 exhausted, filthy, upright cadets. "All 7 of you. That has happened in this program 4 times in 11 years. I want each of you to understand what you just did before medical takes you, because the exhaustion will make you forget by tomorrow how large this was." He paused, and something in his voice, for once, was not instructional at all. "I built this course to find the floor underneath what a candidate knows. I did not build it expecting to learn something about my own doctrine in the process. I have that correction to make, and I intend to make it properly, in writing, to the board that classifies which species this track is mandatory for." His eyes settled, briefly, on Milo. "Starting with the file that should never have been filed as an error in the first place. Medical cleared all 7 within the hour, bruised, dehydrated, run down to the studs, but structurally sound, no injuries beyond what a night's rest and a real meal would fix. Fen Adair's core temperature had held steady since the corridor fault. Dre Ilkoth's hip, still tender from the checkpoint fall 3 weeks earlier, was cleared with nothing worse than a recommendation to ice it. Milo Vance's readout, the corpsman noted with the same faint bewilderment every proctor on this certification had shown at some point over the last 30 hours, showed a body that had run 30 hours of compounding hostile load and come out the other side reading, essentially, tired. Just tired. Nothing underneath it had cracked. He signed the discharge form, thanked the corpsman, and asked, in the same flat, unbothered voice he'd used on a proctor 8 weeks earlier after 8 hours in a gravity chamber, what time the mess hall started serving lunch. Word had beaten him to the mess hall again. It always did. By the time Milo Vance walked through the doors, showered, in a clean uniform, 31 hours removed from the start of a certification that had put 4 cadets in medical over the past decade badly enough to end their careers, the entire cadet deck had already heard some version of the story. The corridor fault, the 4 minutes with Fen Adair, the 7 cadets crossing the final line together, Dre Ilkoth carrying first case for the human he'd once put his hands on in anger. Every table in the hall, filtered air pockets and sealed trays and all, had a line of sight to the door, and every one of them turned to watch him walk in. He did not slow down for the attention. He collected a tray, loaded it with reconstituted protein and field greens, the same lunch he'd have eaten on any other Tuesday, and carried it to the human-rated station at the same unhurried pace he'd used to walk a gravity chamber 8 weeks earlier. The hall had gone, by the time he sat down, almost entirely quiet. Praxis Ille broke it first, sliding his own tray onto the bench across from him, the way he had in week 5, except this time 3 more trays followed Sunkai, Fen Adair, and last, moving a little stiffly on the hip that had hit a checkpoint deck 3 weeks earlier, Dre Ilkoth, who set his tray down without asking permission and did not look away when Milo glanced up at him. "Room staring," Sunkai said, gill slits fluttering at the attention. "You know that." "I noticed," Milo said and started eating. "You just finished the hardest thing this academy runs," Fen said, wings still favoring one side from the corridor fault, voice somewhere between disbelief and something closer to awe. 30 hours, a real medical emergency in the middle of it, and you're sitting here eating lunch like it's any other day. Milo considered the question the way he considered most things handed to him plainly, without performance, because performing significance had never once occurred to him as something worth doing. "It is any other day," he said. "Just one that happened to have 30 rough hours in the front half of it. Doesn't change what comes after. Body's still hungry, trays still here." Seemed like the next thing to do. "That's not an answer most people would give," Praxis said. "Most people would want to talk about it. Turn it into a story right away while it's still fresh, before they forget the shape of it." "I'll remember the shape of it fine without talking it into something bigger than it was," Milo said. 30 hours is 30 hours. I've had worse weeks that didn't come with a certificate at the end." He glanced at Dre, who had said nothing yet, tray untouched in front of him. "You good?" Dre's mandibles clicked slow, the closest his anatomy came to an unguarded expression. "I put my hands on you 3 weeks ago," he said, "in front of the whole cohort. I told myself it was about the integrity of the track. It wasn't. It was about a version of myself I needed to be right, and you made it very difficult to keep being right about it." He paused. "I don't know the word for what I owe you instead. My species doesn't have an easy one for this." "Don't owe me anything," Milo said. "You carried first case today without being asked." "That's the only ledger I was keeping, and it's already clear." Across the hall, from the observation window that ran the length of the officers' section, Instructor Kosh watched the table with all 4 eyes for a long moment before Sunkai's earlier report, the one she'd filed at hour 3 of the certification, flagging a sentence about fear that never left, only got small enough to carry, surfaced again in his memory, unbidden, and settled somewhere he suspected it would stay for a long time. He had spent 11 years believing toughness was a birthright certain species were born owning. He had built a curriculum, a chamber, a reputation on that belief, and had watched over 8 weeks a soft-world cadet from a district his own government's classification board did not think worth updating quietly take that belief apart, not through argument, not through defiance, but simply by walking every hour of every block the same steady way he'd walked a fire line at 15. And then, 31 hours after the hardest thing this academy had ever asked of a cadet, sitting down to a tray of reconstituted protein like the whole ordeal had cost him nothing more than an inconvenient morning. It had cost him something, Kosh knew now, having read the isolation sector transcript and the name that had surfaced in it, Casey Rule, a fire crew, a water station, a decision that had held the line and still hadn't been enough. It had cost him plenty over the years, paid in installments Kosh doubted the boy had ever once billed to anyone but himself. The lunch was not the absence of a cost. It was what carrying a cost well for long enough eventually looked like from the outside: steady hands, a level voice, and a body that had simply learned, the hard way, long before any academy got hold of it, how to keep functioning underneath a weight that would have flattened someone who had never had to carry anything at all. "Cadet Vance," Kosh said, over the hall's general channel, loud enough that every table in the room heard it, because he had decided, watching that boy eat lunch like nothing had happened, that some things deserved saying where the whole room could hear. Milo looked up. "Sir." "The Deathworld track exists," Kosh said, "to certify that an officer candidate can hold command judgment when a hostile world offers no mercy and no schedule. In 11 years, I have watched 141 cadets attempt that certification. I have never in 11 years watched one of them walk out of the final gate and ask a proctor what time lunch was being served. Not once, until 8 weeks ago, in Chamber 4, and now again today." He paused, and the whole hall held its silence with him. "I built this course to find the floor beneath what a cadet knows. I would like the record to reflect that I have finally found a floor deep enough that 30 hours of my own worst design could not reach the bottom of it. Congratulations on your certification, cadet. Eat your lunch." It was, by the standards of a species that did not go in for public praise, close to the warmest thing Kosh Vrathis had ever said to a cadet in front of a full mess hall, and Milo Vance took it the same way he took everything else that had happened to him in the last 8 weeks, with a small, tired nod, a quiet "thank you, sir," and a fork that went right back to his tray, because the food was getting cold, and there was, in his plain and unglamorous accounting of the world, no better use for the next 5 minutes than finishing a meal he'd earned the ordinary way, by getting through the day in front of him and letting that be enough. The 6 days between the certification and graduation passed in the particular slow, tender quiet that follows any hard thing finally finished: medical follow-ups, gear inventories, the long, dull paperwork of a track closing out, and evenings the cohort spent together in the mess hall, not because any schedule required it, but because none of them, not even Dre, seemed ready yet to let the last 8 weeks simply end. On the 4th evening, Fen Adair asked the question the rest of them had circled without quite landing on since the isolation sector. "The name," he said, careful, watching Milo across the table the way a cohort mate watched someone they respected too much to pry carelessly. "The one you talked to Ress about, Casey. You don't have to tell us if you don't want to." Milo turned his cup once between his hands before he answered, because some things deserved the extra second even when the answer itself was simple. "A friend," he said, "died holding a line when I was 16. I think about him more than I let on and less than he probably deserves. That's most of it. Rest is mine to carry, not much of a story beyond that." Nobody pushed further, and nobody needed to, because the cohort had spent 8 weeks learning exactly how much weight sat under Milo Vance's flat, unhurried sentences, and had learned, alongside that, the specific respect owed to a man who told you plainly when a subject had reached the edge of what he meant to share. Sunkai reached across the table and set her hand briefly over his, a gesture her species used sparingly and only for grief it recognized as real, and the conversation moved on to easier things: posting rumors, graduation logistics, Dre's dry, deadpan complaint that Vrathi dress uniforms were not built for a hip that still ached from a checkpoint deck 3 weeks earlier. And the evening closed like most of the evenings that week, with 7 exhausted cadets simply glad, in the plainest possible way, to still have each other's company at the same table. Graduation for Cohort 9 Reach came 6 days later, in the same amphitheater Kelvax station used for every combined core ceremony, tiered seating built to accommodate 17 different species' preferred posture, some rows fitted with perches, some with low troughs for species that did not sit so much as settle, some with standard chairs for the rest. 11 cadets had entered the Deathworld track's final term. 7 stood on the floor that morning in dress uniform, the other 4 already reassigned to postings that matched skills they'd proven elsewhere on the Academy's wider curriculum. No shame in any of it, because the track had done exactly what it was built to do. Sort candidates honestly, without pretending honesty was the same thing as cruelty. Commandant Allreth, an older Vrathi with a scarred foreleg and a voice that carried without needing to be raised, presided over the ceremony, and read the 7 names in the order the core administrative system generated them. Alphabetical by surname, species designation appended. No favoritism shown to the cadet whose graduation the entire station had spent the last week discussing. Adair Fenn, Ithir Auxiliary Track Certified. Ile Praxis, Calorin Combat Track Certified. Ilkoth Dre, Vrathi Command Track Certified. Milo watched Dre cross the floor to receive his certification chip from the commandant's hand, hip still faintly stiff, standing straighter than Milo had ever seen him stand, and thought, without any particular ceremony to the thought, that whatever the 2 of them had started on a checkpoint deck 3 weeks earlier had ended somewhere better than either of them could have predicted the day it began. Kai Soon, Ithir Environmental Command Track Certified. Soon Kai crossed the floor with her gill slits fluttering wide, the closest her species came to an open, unguarded grin, and caught Milo's eye across the amphitheater on her way back to the standing cadets, a look that said, plainly, without needing words for it, that she intended to hold him to every promise the last 8 weeks had quietly made without either of them saying so directly. Ut Bren, Dural Engineering Track Certified. Bren Ut crossed the floor next, steady on legs that had nearly cost him his certification in a stretch of unforgiving heat back in Sector 2, and found, waiting for him at the base of the dais, Asaf Ray's hand raised in the flat, open-palmed gesture Corin cadets used among themselves to mark a debt settled. The same debt paid 300 meters from an extraction line neither of them would ever describe as anything other than what it plainly was. Vance Milo, Human Command Track Certified. He crossed the floor the same way he'd crossed every stretch of ground this certification had put in front of him, unhurried, steady, and took the certification chip from Commandant Reth's hand with a nod that was, in its own quiet way, the only kind of ceremony he'd ever much cared for. Cadet Vance, the Commandant's voice low, meant mostly for him, though the amphitheater's acoustics carried it further than she likely intended. Instructor Kosh has filed an unusual report alongside your certification. He recommends a review of your species' Deathworld classification status, citing your term's performance as evidence the current rating no longer reflects conditions on record in at least one documented region of your homeworld. She studied him with old, careful eyes, the kind that had seen a great many cadets cross this floor over a long career, and had learned by now which ones were worth a second look. Is that report accurate in your judgment? Yes, ma'am, Milo said. It's accurate. Then I will see it forwarded to the classification board myself, she said. It is not often this academy corrects a species rating on the strength of a single cadet's record. I suspect, after this term, we will be correcting it on the strength of several. Vray Asa, Corin Engineering Track Certified. The ceremony finished. The 7 graduates dispersed into an afternoon of family calls and reassignment briefings, and the particular exhausted contentment that came after 8 weeks of the hardest thing any of them had ever done. And Instructor Kosh found Milo Vance alone at the amphitheater's edge afterward, looking out through the same reinforced viewport where he and Soon Kai had once watched a dead moon that did not care what anyone chose to survive. Your posting orders came through this morning, Kosh said, holding out a data slate. Forward deployment joint survey escort out past the settled systems. It is not a soft assignment. I did not request it soft on your behalf, because I do not believe you would have wanted me to. You'd be right, Milo said, taking the slate. There is a note attached from the Classification Review Board, Kosh added. Preliminary, not final, but they have opened a full survey of the region you described. The Ember Flats will likely carry a new designation within the year. Not Deathworld, your government would object to that framing, and it would not be accurate to the whole planet, but something closer to the truth than Garden Colony. He paused. You did that, not the Academy. You, sitting in a mess hall telling the truth about where you came from to a cadet who asked. Didn't do it for the file, Milo said. Just answered a question honestly. I am aware, Kosh said. That is, in my experience, usually how the largest corrections happen. Not through campaigns. Through someone simply refusing to lie about a small thing, consistently, until enough people notice the lie was ever there. Milo looked out at the moon a while longer, turning the certification chip over once in his hand, thinking about a water station that had held, and a name he still carried, and 8 weeks that had asked him, in 100 different ways, whether the thing that had gotten him through a burning district at 15 would hold up against a curriculum built by people who had never once smelled smoke on a wind shift. It had held. He'd known it would, the same plain, unglamorous way he'd known the math on a 40-kilometer march or an 11-hour fire line. Not with confidence exactly, just with the settled certainty of a person who had already done the arithmetic once, a long time ago, and never needed to redo it. Thank you, sir, he said, for the report, and for not correcting the file 3 weeks in when you could have. I nearly did, Kosh admitted. In week 1, when I first found the error, I very nearly transferred you out before anyone above me noticed it had ever been wrong. I am glad now that curiosity outran caution that particular morning. It does not always. They stood at the viewport a while longer, instructor and cadet, in a silence that had become, somewhere over 8 hard weeks, comfortable rather than formal, and neither of them felt any particular need to fill it with more words than the moment actually required. The Joint Survey Escort assignment put Milo Vance, 6 weeks after graduation, on a transport called the Rel Covenant, bound for a border system the core charts listed only by catalog number, escorting a mixed team of Coran and Dural surveyors mapping a world flagged for potential settlement. He had not expected the posting to reunite him with anyone from Nine Reach. The Corps rarely kept cohorts together past graduation, scattering fresh officers across postings the way a hand-scattered seed, trusting the training to travel even when the faces around it changed. He had not expected it, and so he felt something close to relief, boarding the Covenant's lower deck, when he found Sunkai already stationed there, assigned as the mission's environmental specialist, gill slits flaring in something like a smile when she spotted him coming down the gangway. Small Corps, she said. Small enough, Milo agreed, and did not need to say more than that for both of them to understand it as good news. The world below them, once the Covenant settled into orbit, read on the survey charts as promising and unremarkable temperate band, breathable atmosphere, moderate seismic activity. No apex predation flagged in the initial long-range scans. It was the kind of rating, Milo thought, looking at the numbers, that a classification board could get wrong in either direction. And he did not say that thought out loud to anyone, because it was not yet proven, only a plain observation filed away the way he filed most things, under information rather than alarm. The survey team's ground camp went up on the 3rd day without incident. A modest cluster of prefab shelters at the edge of a river delta, the long-range scans had flagged as the best site for a future settlement's fresh water access. Milo's escort detachment, 4 officers, himself included, under a Dural mission commander named Tar Bosk, ran perimeter rotations while the surveyors ran their instruments, and for 6 days the posting felt, by any Deathworld standard he'd trained against, close to gentle. It stopped feeling gentle on the 7th night, when the delta's water level rose 4 meters in under 2 hours, far faster than any tidal or rainfall model the survey charts accounted for, and the ground camp sensor net, tuned for predator movement rather than hydrology, gave the team almost no warning before the first surge hit the shelter line. Flash flood, Sunkai's voice cracked out over the camp channel, already moving, her ether physiology reading the water's chemical signature faster than any instrument could. This isn't rain runoff. There's a mineral load in it upstream, something's breached. A natural dam, maybe a reservoir basin the long-range scan never mapped. This is going to keep rising. The camp had 11 people in it that night, 4 escort officers, 6 surveyors and Commander Bosk, spread across 3 shelters, 2 of which sat directly in the surge's path. Panic in a situation like that cost seconds that nobody in a flood had to spare, and Milo watched it start to take hold in the camp within the first 90 seconds. A young Koran surveyor named Isvel freezing at her shelter's entrance, unable to decide whether to grab her instrument case or simply run, precious time bleeding away while the water climbed toward her ankles and then, faster than that, toward her knees. Milo had been in exactly this kind of moment before, on a road too cracked for trucks, watching people who'd never trained for disaster freeze in the seconds that mattered most, and he did not shout, because shouting had never once, in his experience, unfroze anyone. It only added one more loud thing to a mind already overloaded. His voice, close level, cutting through the rising waters, roar the way it had cut through a gravity chamber's crush 8 months earlier. Leave the case. Grab the strap on my shoulder. We're walking to high ground together right now at my pace. She grabbed the strap. He walked her out at a pace that felt, to her, impossibly unhurried given the water climbing past her thighs. But that got them both to the ridgeline above the delta with 40 seconds to spare before the second surge, larger than the first, swept through the exact spot her shelter had stood. Commander Bosk, a solid, methodical Dural officer who had run a dozen survey escorts without ever once seeing his ground team come this close to losing someone, watched Milo's steady progress across the camp from the ridgeline with an expression his species did not often wear. Something close to disbelief. The specific disbelief of a career officer watching a junior cadet handle a genuine, unscripted, life-threatening emergency with the exact, unbothered composure most people only managed after they'd survived a dozen like it. "You've done this before," Bosk said, once the last of the camp's 11 personnel had been accounted for on the ridgeline, soaked, shaken, but alive, watching the delta below swallow the ground camp's remaining structures under a churn of mineral-heavy water. "Something like it," Milo said. "Not this exact flavor of disaster, close enough cousin, though. Half this camp is going to write home about the officer who walked a flood at a jogger's pace and never once raised his voice," Bosk said. "I have run this job for 15 years. I have never seen anyone do what you just did without so much as a change in their breathing." "Wasn't trying to make a point," Milo said, watching the water below, the last of the shelters folding under the current. "Just didn't see the upside in panicking faster than the water was rising. Panicking doesn't drain a delta any quicker. It just means you drown scared instead of just drowning, and I've never seen the appeal in that particular upgrade." Sunkai, standing beside him on the ridgeline, soaked to the collar, gill slits working hard in the thin night air, looked at him for a long moment, the same look she'd given him in a mess hall 8 months earlier, turning a sentence over, looking for the seam in it, and finding, once again, that there wasn't one. "You're really not built like the rest of us," she said, quiet mostly to herself. "I'm built exactly like the rest of you," Milo said. "I just had a rougher childhood teaching my body what to do with the fear instead of letting it drive. That's the whole difference. It's not a bigger secret than that. Never has been." The Covenant's rescue shuttle reached the ridgeline 40 minutes later, once the water's rise had finally slowed against the delta's natural banks, and pulled all 11 survivors up to orbit with nothing worse than soaked gear, a handful of minor cold exposure cases, and a survey mission that would need to be rerun from a safer site once the classification board updated the world's hydrology rating, a rating that had, like Earth's, simply never been checked closely enough by anyone who had actually stood in the flood. Commander Bosk filed his mission report 3 days later, and included, alongside the standard incident summary, a personal commendation for Officer Vance that used a phrase he had never once written in 15 years of survey escort reports. Exhibited command judgment under compounding, unscripted crisis at a level this officer's record suggests is not learned, but earned, and recommended without reservation, for any posting this Corps considers too difficult for most. Isvel found Milo 2 mornings later, once the surviving camp had been relocated to higher ground, and the surveyors had begun the slow work of cataloging what the flood had cost them, and stood in front of him for a moment before she managed to say what she'd apparently come to say. "I froze," she said, feathers along her jaw still faintly disordered from a night she had clearly not slept well since. "At the shelter entrance. I couldn't decide between the case and running, and if you hadn't been there, you'd have decided on your own a few seconds later and probably made it out fine anyway," Milo said. "Water doesn't care whether you freeze for 2 seconds or 20 most nights. Yours happened to be a night where 2 seconds mattered. That's not a verdict on you. That's just bad luck lining up against good timing on my end." "That's a kind way to put it." "It's an accurate way to put it," Milo said. "First real disaster anybody's ever in. Most people freeze at least once. I froze plenty, my first few seasons on a fire line, before my body learned what to do with the fear instead of just standing there arguing with it. You'll get there. Everybody does, if the ground gives them the chance to try again, and yours did." He nodded toward the rebuilt shelter line, the surveyors already back at their instruments, cataloging a world that had very nearly killed 11 of them and would, within the year, carry a corrected hydrology rating because of it. "Way I figure it, the only real failure would have been you deciding after last night that you didn't have it in you. Everything else is just a rough night on the way to finding out you did." The survey escort assignment kept Milo and Sunkai out past the settled systems for another 4 months, running a second camp on a safer stretch of the same world, once the hydrology survey had been corrected. And by the time the Rel Covenant finally set a return course for Kelvac Station, the mineral flood incident had traveled through the Corps officer network the way stories about calm under real, unscripted crisis always traveled, not as gossip, but as the specific kind of professional legend that got passed from mission commander to mission commander in the margins of otherwise dry reports. Because every officer who had ever led a team through a genuine emergency understood exactly how rare it was to find someone who did not need the emergency to end before their judgment steadied out. Kosh Vrathai's read Commander Bosk's report twice, the second time slower than the first, sitting in the same small office where he had once asked a soft-world cadet to tell him the truth about a district called the Ember Flats, and found himself, for the second time in less than a year, doing something he had not expected his career to still make room for, revising a belief he had carried since before this particular cadet was born. The classification board's review, opened on the strength of Kosh's original report and closed, 5 months later, on the strength of an independent hydrology survey, and a flood incident report that had nothing directly to do with fire seasons at all, updated Earth's regional designation for the Ember Flats district from stable temperate biosphere to variable hazard zone, subclass wildfire drought, a rating that did not by itself change the human species' overall soft world classification. Because a single region's hardship had never been the same thing as a whole planet's, but that opened, for the first time, a formal pathway for human cadets from documented hazard districts to petition directly onto the Deathworld track, a pathway 3 cadets used within the year. None of them from the Ember Flats specifically, one from a flood district on a different continent, one from a mountain region prone to avalanche collapse, one from a coastal strip that had spent a decade losing ground to rising water an inch at a time. None of that was Milo Vance's doing exactly, in the sense that he had never once set out to change a classification board's paperwork. He had simply answered honest questions honestly, in a mess hall, in an office, on a checkpoint deck, and let the consequences of that honesty travel as far as they were going to travel, because performing a cause had never once interested him the way actually living one had. He learned about the classification update the same way he learned most news that concerned him, plainly, without ceremony, in a short message from Kosh waiting for him when the Covenant docked at Kelvac Station. Cadet Vance, the board's review closed this morning. 3 petitions filed within the hour. I thought you should hear it from me before the general bulletin reached you. Whatever else this certification produced, I consider this the correction I am proudest to have put my name to. Kosh Vrathis. Milo read it twice, standing in the docking corridor with his gear bag still over one shoulder, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief, closer to the plain, settled satisfaction of watching a fire line finally hold after a long night of not knowing whether it would. He thought briefly of Casey Rule, and of a relay station that had stood because 6 people had held a line they were never trained to hold, and found that the thought, this time, carried less weight than it usually did. Not because the weight was gone, it never fully went, but because some of it, finally, had found somewhere useful to set itself down. He forwarded the message to nobody. He did not need anyone else to know what it meant to him. He simply put it away, the same way he put away most things that mattered too much to talk about casually, and went to find out where his gear was being billeted for the 2 weeks of leave the Corps owed him before his next posting came through. Praxis Ile found him on the 3rd day of that leave, in the same observation deck where Milo and Sunkai had once watched a dead moon, and dropped into the seat beside him without asking, the way he had learned to do somewhere around week 5 of a certification neither of them would ever fully stop carrying. "Command track's treating you well," Praxis said, nodding at the fresh insignia on Milo's collar. "Bosk's report is already required reading for the next escort rotation. 3 separate officers have asked me what you're actually like, off the record, because the report reads like it's exaggerating." "It's not exaggerating," Milo said. "It's just describing an ordinary Tuesday that happened to have a flood in it." Praxis's ears came up, the small tell that meant he was fighting a laugh and mostly losing. "You say that about everything. Gravity chambers, toxic gas, a flash flood that nearly drowned 11 people, all of it an ordinary Tuesday." "Most of it was," Milo said. "That's not me being modest. It's just accurate. The ordinary version of a Tuesday where I grew up already had most of that in it minus the flood. I just hadn't met a flood specifically before this one. And when you do meet the next thing you haven't met specifically before." Milo considered the question the way he considered most things Praxis asked him now, honestly, without performance, because 8 months and 1 certification had earned that between them. "Same as always," he said. "Figure out what the next 100 meters of it needs from me, do that part, and let the part after take care of itself when it gets here. Hasn't failed me yet. Don't see a reason to trade it in for something fancier." Praxis looked out at the station's ring, the dead moon turning slow and silent beyond the viewport, and thought, not for the first time since a checkpoint march 8 months earlier, that he had come to this academy convinced toughness was a thing certain species were simply born owning, the way his own people were born fast, born lean, born built for the chase. He had graduated it instead, having learned that toughness was not a birthright at all. It was a floor somebody built, one hard year at a time, out of whatever their own particular piece of the universe had demanded of them, and that the measure of an officer worth following was never how far above that floor they stood, but how steady they kept their footing on it, no matter how many rooms full of strangers turned to stare when they finally proved it. His own posting orders had come through the same week, A combat track assignment aboard a strike escort running interdiction along a shipping corridor known for exactly the kind of fast, close quarters engagements his species' bodies were built for. And he told Milo, before he left the observation deck, that he intended to run every pursuit the way he'd run the last 400 meters of Chamber 6 all those months ago. Not straight, not proud, but smart, cutting the angle whenever a straight line would only get him killed faster. I used to think that was a concession, he said, running an angle instead of a line. My whole life I was taught speed was the only virtue that mattered, and cutting an angle looked like admitting you didn't have enough of it. Doesn't feel like a concession anymore. Feels like the difference between cadets who finish a course and cadets who get carried out of one. He clasped a hand briefly to Milo's shoulder, an unusually physical gesture for a Caloran outside of combat or challenge, and left him with the moon and the quiet, carrying into his own posting a lesson that had cost a human cadet nothing to teach and had cost Praxis, in the end, only his pride. Dre Ilkoth's posting orders had come through the same week as Milo's. A command slot on a frontier patrol cutter running border security along a stretch of contested space that had, in the 11 years before his arrival, chewed through 4 junior officers who could not hold their judgment together under the particular pressure of long silences broken by sudden violence. He wrote to Milo twice in the first 2 months, short messages, formal in the way Vrath correspondence tended to be even between people who had stopped being formal with each other in person. And in the second one, he included a line that told Milo more about how the posting was going than any status report could have. I ordered a retreat last week that cost us a supply cache we could not afford to lose. 3 of my crew argued I should have held position instead. I did not hold position, because holding it would have cost lives instead of cargo, and I have found, since the isolation sector, that I no longer need to be certain I made the perfect call. I only need to be certain I made the honest one, and could sit with the recorder afterward and say why. I do not know if this makes sense outside of Rathley's head. I wanted you to know it regardless. Milo wrote back a short reply, because that was the length their correspondence had settled into and neither of them saw a reason to force it longer. Makes plenty of sense. That's the whole job most days. Glad the crew's still arguing with you instead of burying you. Means you're doing something right. Fen Adair's letters came more often, longer, full of details about an auxiliary posting that had him running joint rescue coordination between 3 species medical corps, a job that put his species' altitude tolerance and his own particular experience of nearly dying in a broken corridor to direct, practical use. In his 4th letter he described, in more detail than his usual brief updates, a mountain collapse rescue on a settlement world where a Dural work crew had been trapped under ice at an altitude that put every other species on the response team into oxygen distress within 20 minutes. An altitude Fenn's hollow-boned, high-flying physiology handled without strain, and how he had spent 6 hours ferrying line and supplies up a rock face nobody else on the team could safely climb. Thinking the entire time, he admitted, about a corridor that had once nearly cost him everything and a human voice that had kept him talking about his sister's cargo runs until help arrived. I used to think my body was the wrong shape for this work, he wrote. Too light for combat, too fragile for the ground postings everyone else wanted. Turns out the ground was never the only place worth being strong in. I just needed someone to tell me that once plainly when it mattered. He signed every message the same way, still carrying it, still lighter than it was. Milo understood exactly what he meant by that, because he had told him once on a march that felt now like a different lifetime, that the trick was never getting rid of the weight. It was learning which parts of it you could set down and which parts you were always going to keep, and making peace with carrying the second kind well. He returned to Kelvax Station 11 months after his own graduation, on a short rotation between postings, and found the Deathworld wing running its diagnostic blocks for a new cohort 9 reaches designation retired now. A fresh cycle begun. New cadets from 6 different worlds learning, in Chamber 4, what 2.5 standard gravity felt like for the first time. Kosh spotted him in the observation gallery before he'd said a word, 4 eyes finding him across the room with the ease of an instructor who had spent 11 years learning to read a doorway before anyone walked through it. "Come to relive it," Kosh said, "or come to torment yourself watching it happen to someone else?" "Neither," Milo said. "Core put me on liaison duty for a week while my next posting finalizes. Figured I'd see how the new group's doing." Down in the chamber, a young cadet, a human, the first human besides Milo the Deathworld track had run since the classification review opened its new pathway, a girl who could not have been more than 19, walking her lane through the crushing gravity with her jaw set hard, and her hands shaking at her sides despite the set of her jaw, caught Milo's attention the way a struggling fire crew member had always caught it, not with pity, but with the specific, practical recognition of someone who remembered exactly what that particular kind of shaking felt like from the inside. "She's from a coastal district," Kosh said, following his gaze. "Ground's been losing to the water for a decade where she grew up. Petitioned onto this track herself, first cadet from the new pathway to make it past intake screening." "She's not going to make it past hour 4 at that pace," Milo said. "She's fighting the gravity instead of walking through it, burning fuel she's going to need later." "You could tell her that." Milo considered it for a moment, watching her lane through the observation glass, and then did something he had not planned on doing when he walked into the gallery, keyed the short-range coaching channel, the same one cadets weren't technically supposed to use, and spoke into it in the same flat, unhurried voice that had once carried a boy named Finn adair the last 4 kilometers of a forced march. "Cadet," he said, "you're fighting the pressure instead of moving with it. Slow your stride, drop your shoulders an inch, let the gravity have your weight instead of arguing with it for every step. It's not going anywhere. Arguing just costs you air you're going to want in about 3 hours." The girl's head came up, startled, scanning for the voice's source, and found nothing but the gallery glass far above her, an unfamiliar accent she couldn't place delivering advice she had no reason yet to trust. "Who is this?" she said, breath already tight. "Somebody who walked this same lane 11 months ago," Milo said. "Somebody who came from a place that already taught your body most of what this course is trying to teach it. You don't have to fight the fear out of yourself today. You just have to learn where to put it down so it stops costing you steps. Took me a long time to learn that. I'm telling you now so it takes you less." He watched her breathing change, slow, deliberate, watched her stride lengthen and settle into something closer to the pace that would actually carry her through 8 hours instead of 4, and felt, standing in the gallery beside an instructor who had once nearly transferred him out of this exact track over a clerical error, something that was not quite pride and not quite nostalgia, closer to the plain satisfaction of watching a line hold because someone downstream had finally been told, in time, how to hold it. "You did not have to do that," Kosh said. "No," Milo agreed. "Didn't cost me anything to do it, though. And it might save her a rough week or 2, learning it now instead of the hard way, like I did." He watched the cadet's lane a moment longer, her stride even now, her shaking hands finally still at her sides. "Figure that's the only real inheritance any of us leave behind in a place like this, not the record. Just whatever we manage to make a little easier for whoever's walking the same lane next." Kosh's mandibles clicked, slow, the closest thing to agreement his anatomy allowed, and the two of them stood at the gallery glass a while longer, watching a new cohort learn, hour by hour, the same hard lesson that every Deathworld eventually taught anyone who survived it long enough to graduate, that the weight never fully went away, that the fear never fully left, and that the only real skill worth certifying was the plain, unglamorous, endlessly repeatable choice to keep walking anyway. One steady step at a time, until the day's worst hour finally, quietly, became the day behind you instead of the day ahead. Dre Ilkoth's Frontier Patrol cutter came under real fire 8 months into his posting, not from any organized force, but from a smuggling convoy that had mistaken the cutter's patrol pattern for a gap in coverage, and reacted to discovery with more firepower than any smuggling operation had any legal right to carry. The first hit took out the cutter's forward shield array. The second knocked out primary comms. On the bridge, with Claxon screaming and half his junior crew looking to him for an order that would either save the ship or lose it, Dre Ilkoth found himself reaching, without quite deciding to, for the same flat, unhurried register he had once resented in a human cadet on a checkpoint deck 3 years earlier. "Helm hardport, put the debris field between us and their firing solution," he said, voice level, chitin cool under the bridge lighting despite a heart rate that would have told a different story to anyone reading his vitals. "Weapons, target their engine array, not the hull. I want them stopped, not dead, until I know who's actually shooting at a core cutter with that much ordnance. Comms, get the secondary array online, priority 1. We need eyes past this debris field before we need anything else." The crew moved. The cutter turned. The convoy, faced with a targeting solution that had disabled 2 of their 3 ships' engines inside 90 seconds without a single hull breach, broke off rather than press an engagement that had stopped going the way they'd planned. Dre's own after-action report, filed that night, credited the outcome to standard doctrine and a well-drilled crew, because Vrath reports did not dwell on sentiment. But in the message he sent Milo 2 days later, the one about the retreat order and the argument with his crew, he had left out the detail he found himself thinking about most in the quiet hours afterward, that somewhere in the 90 seconds between the first hit and the convoy's retreat, he had heard, underneath his own voice giving orders, an echo of a checkpoint deck, a human cadet standing over him after a fall that should have humiliated him, saying, "You're not hurt, get up. We've still got 3 kilometers," and had understood, for the first time with real clarity, that the lesson had never been about grip strength at all. The cadet from the coastal district, her name was Ryan Akafer, though it would be another 2 months before Milo learned her surname from a report Kosh forwarded him without comment, finished the gravity block that day inside the safe margin, one of only 4 in her cohort to do so, and cleared Chamber 2's toxic atmosphere, run 3 weeks later with a filter margin the proctors logged as unremarkable in every way except that it was hers. A soft-world cadet from a flood district petition, holding pace with cadets whose homeworlds had never once needed to teach them anything about water rising where it did not belong. Kosh mentioned her again in a message 6 weeks after that, brief, the way his messages always were. Akafer completed the forced march at hour 16, 4 hours under the field average, carrying Adural cadets packed the final 6 kilometers after the cadet went down with heat exhaustion. She did not ask permission. She simply did it, the same unhurried way you did most things in that chamber 3 years ago, and told the proctor afterward she'd learned it from someone who used to walk this same lane. I did not ask her to specify who. I suspect I already know. Milo read that message twice, standing in the narrow berth of a deep survey transport with the mapped edge of core space still 11 days out, and felt something settle in him that had nothing to do with pride exactly, closer to the plain, quiet satisfaction of a fire crew chief watching a rookie hold a line correctly on their first real season without needing to be told twice. The particular, unglamorous reward of having made one hard thing slightly less hard for somebody walking it after you. Which was, he had come to believe, the only inheritance that had ever mattered in any of the places that had shaped him. He did not write back anything more than "Thank you for telling me. Glad she's carrying it well," because there was nothing else that needed saying, and some debts were better left exactly the size they actually were instead of dressed up into something bigger for the sake of the telling. Soon Kai found him on his last evening at Kelvek Station, in the mess hall of all places, at a table near the buffer strip that had once separated a lone human cadet from the rest of a wary cohort, and now separated nothing much at all, since half the tables in the hall these days sat mixed. species blending across the old boundary lines, the way water eventually found its way around whatever had once been built to stop it. "Heard your next posting finalized," she said, sliding her tray onto the bench across from him, gill slits flat and still. The resting state that had taken him weeks once to learn meant curiosity rather than alarm. "Deep survey command. 3-year rotation, out past anywhere the core has mapped properly. Word travels fast." Word travels exactly as fast as you'd expect. For the cadet who finished lunch after the hardest certification this academy runs and then went and did it again, after a flood nearly drowned 11 people, she said. And there was no mockery in it. Only the same dry, careful fondness she'd carried toward him since a mess hall conversation 8 months earlier about cortisol markers and fire lines. 3 years is a long rotation, Vance. It is. You're not worried about it. Milo thought about that honestly, the way he thought about most things she asked him, because 8 months of her sideways questions eventually landing on the direct ones had taught him she deserved nothing less. "I'm not worried," he said. 3 years out past the mapped edge is a long time to be the only backup anybody's got if something goes wrong. But I've done the arithmetic on it the same way I do the arithmetic on everything. However long it is, it's exactly that long and no longer, and I'll have whatever I need to carry it when I get there, same as I always have." He looked at her, and something in his flat, steady voice softened just slightly, the closest he came most days to sentiment. "I'll miss having someone around who asks the right question instead of the easy one, though. That part I mean plainly." Sun-Kai's gill slits fluttered once, a small betrayal of feeling her species could not fully suppress even when composure was the goal. "I put in for a transfer," she said. "Deep survey division. Environmental specialist slots are thin, but they're not non-existent, and I've spent enough of my career studying water on worlds that don't have enough of it. I'd like to study some that have too much for a change." She held his gaze, steady, direct. The way she'd learned to be direct with him somewhere around a checkpoint deck, and a question about fear. "If the posting comes through, you'll have someone asking the right questions a good deal longer than one dinner." "Would like that," Milo said, plainly, because plain was the only register he had ever trusted with things that mattered, and Sun-Kai, who had spent 8 months learning to read exactly how much weight his plain sentences carried underneath their flat delivery, understood it for the real answer it was. "For what it's worth," she added, quieter now, "I don't think I ever told you what it did for the rest of us, watching you get through this term the way you did. Not the flood, not the certification. Just the ordinary weeks in between, where you never once made the rest of us feel small for struggling with something you weren't struggling with the same way." Her gill slits settled, still. The resting state that had taken him months to learn meant something closer to trust than calm. "Praxis told me once he came here believing toughness was a birthright. I think what you actually taught this cohort was closer to the opposite, that it's a debt everybody pays differently, and none of us get to judge how steep somebody else's installment plan looks from the outside." "Didn't set out to teach anybody that," Milo said. "Just tried to get through the weeks the only way I knew how." "I know," Sun-Kai said. "That's exactly why it landed the way it did." They ate the rest of the meal without hurrying, the way two people ate together when neither of them needed to fill every silence with something. And around them, the mess hall carried on its ordinary evening noise. New cadets from 6 worlds trading stories about a gravity block that had terrified all of them. An instructor's flat, unbothered warning still ringing in half their ears. A cohort slowly discovering, the way every cohort eventually did, that the hardest thing this academy asked of them was never really the gravity or the gas or the cold. It was learning, one hard hour at a time, what was actually underneath everything they thought they knew about themselves, and finding out when the floor finally came whether anything solid was waiting there to catch them. Milo Vance shipped out 3 days later, gear stowed, orders logged, a certification chip in his kit that had cost him 30 hours, and in the accounting that mattered more than any chip, a great deal more than that before he'd ever set foot on Kelvac's station at all. He stood at the observation port of the transport, carrying him out past the edge of anywhere the Corps had properly mapped, watching the station's ring recede into the dark, and thought, without any particular drama attached to the thought, about a water relay station that had held because 6 people held a line they were never trained to hold, about a boy named Casey Rule whose name he still carried and always would, about a gravity chamber and a flood delta, and an isolation cell where an old grief had risen up out of the dark to meet him and found, once again, that it could not knock him down, only remind him, the way it always did, of exactly how much a person could survive and still get up the next morning and ask, plainly, without shame, what time breakfast was being served. Somewhere behind him, on a station orbiting a dead moon that had never once had to decide how to meet anything at all, a new cohort was learning, hour by hour, gravity block by gravity block, the same lesson he had learned a long time before any academy ever tried to teach it to him. That the floor beneath a person was never a fixed thing, handed out at birth by whichever world happened to raise them. It was built, one unbearable hour at a time, out of whatever that world demanded and however much a person chose, again and again quietly, without anyone watching, to keep paying it. He had paid his a long time ago, on a fire line at 15, in a district no classification board had ever thought worth updating. Whatever came next 3 years past the mapped edge, a delta or a desert or a dark he hadn't met yet specifically, he already knew, with the same plain, unglamorous certainty that had carried him through every hour since, that he had what it took to meet it the same way he'd met all the rest. He would do the work. He would carry what needed carrying, and when it was finally, mercifully over, he would sit down without ceremony and finish his lunch like nothing had happened at all, because by then, for him, it never really had. It was just another day that asked more of him than most, and he had never once, not since he was a boy holding a line against a wall of fire 40 meters out, believed that a hard day was the same thing as a broken one.